Lord of Mystery, The Undead Don't Die from Passing Fire by author Ni Di Xun Zong. Chapter 311-320. Welcome to Fanfic Audiobook, your go-to place for immersive audiobooks. If you enjoy the content, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to our channel for more amazing stories. And those who want to support me, I have a Patreon channel, get early access to video on Patreon. Chapter 311, Can't I Come? Backland, south of the bridge. In April in Backland, bright sunlight penetrated the thin clouds and shone on every corner of Backland. Emlyn White pulled down his silk top hat to block the sunlight penetrating the clouds, and while leaving the carriage and walking towards the Harvest Church, he half closed his eyes and grumbled. The weather is really bad, the worst season in Backland is coming soon. Emlyn White complained as he walked into the Harvest Church. With a glance, he saw Father Utravsky, who was wearing a brown clerical robe and a soft hat, standing like a mountain in front of the holy emblem of life, preaching to the few believers who came to pray in the morning. Emlyn didn't look any further and walked straight into the back of the church, came to his own room, skillfully changed into his clerical robe, and began to wipe the candlestick. Suddenly, Emlyn felt a shadow fall on him, and turned around alertly, finding a strange man he had never seen before standing beside him. The newcomer asked, "Emlyn White?" Emlyn asked alertly, "Who are you?" The newcomer smiled. "Ember, you can also call me, Lover." Emlyn White cursed in his heart, is he a gay? But just as he was about to lash out, a horrifying thought suddenly popped into Emlyn White's mind. Could it be that, Lover? It couldn't be such a coincidence, could it? Emlyn couldn't help but look at Ember's profile and figure a few more times, and the more he looked, the more familiar he became, almost confirming it. Emlyn tentatively asked, "How did you find me?" Ember answered calmly, "Sherlock Moriarty is my friend." Emlyn's expression immediately froze. He really wanted to curse now. Are detectives also unprofessional? Emlyn White immediately asked with his neck stiff. "Then how can you be sure of my identity?" Ember shrugged and said, "How do I know you are the moon? I guessed, and your reaction told me the answer." Emlyn White was speechless. He was already sure that the person in front of him was Mr. Lover. This was the first time he had met a member of the Tarot Club in reality, but why was he so unhappy? Emlyn stopped dwelling on the issue of identity and asked, "What do you want from me?" They had only met recently at the Tarot Club, and even if they didn't have a chance to talk there, they could pray to Mr. Fool afterwards and ask Mr. Fool to help convey it. But Ember chose to come to him actively. Although he still didn't know how he determined his identity, it was no longer important, the key was the purpose of his visit. Ember glanced at the tall father looking over from not far away, and said in a calm tone, "I need you to take me to see Ulmer." "Duke Ulmer." Emlyn's breath hitched. That was an angel. You just call him by his name, not even willing to call him Duke. Although he met Duke Ulmer every day and indeed had the ability to fulfill Ember's request. But if he really dared to bring an outsider over, Duke Ulmer would definitely kill him. Emlyn White hesitated on how to phrase his words in a polite way. He actually didn't want to take such a risk. Although Mr. Lover had provided him with some help at the Tarot Club, such as selling him the Beander characteristic of Sequence 5 Scarlet Scholar, this help was not enough for him to risk his life for it. But he couldn't refuse directly either. After all, the other party had already come to him actively. No matter how unwilling he was, he could only speak as politely as possible. Ember saw Emlyn White's hesitation and struggle, and said calmly, "I can sell you a Beander characteristic of Sequence 4 Shaman King." Emlyn's breath hitched, and he immediately changed his previous reluctance, nodding without hesitation. "Deal?" Ember asked. "When are we going?" Emlyn's expression became a little subtle, and he said awkwardly, "Maybe we'll have to wait until night. I still have work to do now, and only at night do I have a chance to see Duke Ulmer." When he said the word, work, Emlyn's expression was quite awkward. He, a sanguine, working, at the Earth Mother Church, how did it sound stranger the more he thought about it? Emlyn actually knew very well that although he had the fastest progress in the dream world with the help of the guide provided by the Tarot Club, and had even advanced to the Undead settlement area, successfully reached the Cursed Great Tree, and even Lord Ulmer specifically praised him. But in reality, all the sanguine were secretly mocking him. Emlyn was very clear about the reason. In the hearts of other sanguine, even if he wasn't the most peculiar of his kind, he could definitely rank in the top 10. As a member of a race that has a long life from birth, cultivating one or more hobbies to pass the time is a very common thing, and Emlyn is not the only one who likes dolls. But the problem is that besides buying new dolls and new clothes and going to the hospital to get blood, he rarely goes out and doesn't like to interact with his own kind, unless he is particularly eager for fresher blood, or needs to learn historical knowledge and exchange corresponding materials and items, otherwise he basically doesn't participate in corresponding gatherings. Although Emlyn felt that there was nothing wrong with this, in the eyes of other sanguine, his living state was almost the same as that of several high-ranking figures who were old and frail and had to lie in special coffins to barely maintain their survival, and it was impossible to see that he was a newly adult guy, so he naturally became a topic of conversation when other sanguine gathered and chatted. For so many years before, everyone just talked casually and made a few private jokes, just like discussing various strange people in Backland every day. But when Emlyn reportedly walked into the Harvest Church on his own due to getting lost, was caught by the Bishop of the Earth Mother and locked in the basement, his image began to slide all the way towards the direction of the shame of the sanguine and the protagonist of various jokes, and it was difficult to recover. Emlyn was very aware of this because he had personally heard others speak ill of him. That's why he was so eager for strength. He thought that becoming a baron would change this phenomenon. However, it didn't. Becoming a baron, he did gain some awe, at least those adult vampires no longer dared to joke with him casually. But in the eyes of other barons and viscounts, he was still the shame of the sanguine. He's already a baron, and he's still volunteering at the Harvest Church, isn't that embarrassing? Emlyn dared to be angry but didn't dare to speak, only thinking of becoming stronger as soon as possible, as long as he became a viscount. This kind of voice will become even smaller. Moreover, this is his unique advantage, at least within the sanguine. Although other sanguine can also digest potions through the dream world, their hard limitation is that they lack the Beander characteristics required for promotion. The Beander characteristics within the sanguine are fixed, and unless it is inherited from father to son, it is basically impossible to have the opportunity to inherit the Beander characteristics left by other sanguine. In other words, even the descendants of earls and even marquises can only collect Beander characteristics themselves. And in this regard, no one has more advantage than Emlyn. If he could become an earl, he believed that this kind of voice would completely disappear. On the other hand, Emlyn was actually under a lot of pressure. Within the sanguine, it is actually a normal phenomenon that the sanguine do not get promoted for a long time. After all, there are only so many Beander characteristics, and even the descendants of demigods can only wait for a vacancy to appear to have a chance to inherit. But it was different in the Tarot Club. The members of the Tarot Club were almost advancing one step every day. Even the weakest son is now about to be promoted to Sequence 5 Priest of Light, which gives Emlyn, who is also only Sequence 6, an unprecedented sense of urgency. In the current Tarot Club, it is estimated that only he and son are still at the Sequence 6 level, everyone else is already at Sequence 5, and some are even preparing to impact Sequence 4, such as Mr. World, the Hermit, and Miss Justice. Emlyn didn't expect to catch up with their progress, but at least he couldn't be the last one. And if he could really be promoted to a Sequence 4 Earl, then even without the help of others, he could resist that giant father and completely refuse to volunteer here. And even further, he could force other sanguine to volunteer here. Weren't you mocking him? Then let you also taste the feeling of being mocked. With this thought, Emlyn was in an exceptionally good mood today, and he even wiped the silver candlestick more vigorously. Although during this process, Ember's figure suddenly disappeared. But Emlyn was not worried. He knew that Ember was very likely also an angel. Otherwise it would be impossible to hunt so many demigods. The other party must have mastered spirit world travel, or a similar ability. No matter where he went, he would definitely appear when he got off work. 6 p.m. Emlyn White changed out of the Earth Mother Church's clerical robe, put on a black suit, and put on his silk top hat. He glanced at Utravsky, the half-giant bishop who was standing beside the altar and praying with his eyes closed, and turned around to walk out of the church. Emlyn stood outside the church for a while, muttering softly. Why isn't he here yet? A voice suddenly sounded in his ear. You can go directly, I will follow. Emlyn subconsciously turned his head, and in the shadow cast by the church, Ember's figure slowly emerged. When Emlyn's expression changed slightly, even though he knew Ember was a friend and not an enemy, his sudden appearance still startled him a little. If the other party had been here all along, why hadn't he been able to find him just now? Emlyn couldn't help but blink, but in the blink of an eye, Ember, who had been standing in the shadow, disappeared again. Emlyn didn't look for Ember's figure anymore, but couldn't help but guess, is this the Beander ability, psychological invisibility, from the spectator pathway? Very likely. After all, Mr. Lover and Miss Justice have a very unusual relationship, and they don't seem to have any intention of hiding it, and they don't hide the certain connections that exist between them in reality at the Tarot Club. Thinking this, Emlyn unknowingly walked to the street corner and got into a rented carriage parked by the side of the street. After instructing the destination, he casually cast his gaze towards the opposite side. He subconsciously thought that Ember should be in the carriage, so he tried to find traces of his existence. With him already knowing that someone was there, even psychological invisibility would definitely have flaws, at least theoretically. Although Ember was an angel, the Beyonder ability of psychological invisibility he used came from Miss Justice, and Miss Justice was only a sequence 5 Beyonder, he might not be able to see through it. Emlyn was full of confidence and stared at the seat opposite for a long time. Unfortunately, he found nothing. This made Emlyn a little disappointed, but not discouraged. Because that was after all an angel-level existence, even if he knew the other party was following him, how could he be discovered so easily? The carriage drove all the way and finally stopped outside a villa in the West End. This was the Odra family's villa. Emlyn skillfully walked into the villa and went straight towards the dining room. Hearing the laughter occasionally coming from the dining room, and occasionally hearing words like, Emlyn, and, Earth Mother Church, Emlyn couldn't help but frown and suddenly pushed open the door to the dining room. Crack. At this moment, 11 Sanguine had gathered in the villa's dining room, who were exactly the Sanguine who had entered the dream world with Emlyn. Hearing the movement at the door, they all looked over in unison. The owner of the villa, Casimir Odra, sat at the head of the table, looking at Emlyn who entered the dining room, with a surprised expression. Emlyn, what are you doing here? Emlyn glanced at Casimir Odra at the head of the table. Compared to him, who was only in his 40s, Casimir Odra could be called an older Sanguine. He had been active during Rosal's time and had lived for a full 200 years. But so far, he was only a baron. And Emlyn White, at only 40 years old, was already a baron, and was even about to become a viscount, or even an earl. One day, he would become a Sanguine marquis like Lord Nibeth. No, a duke, or even a prince. Only then could he bear the responsibility of being the savior of the Sanguine. Well, the only problem is that the Beyonder characteristic of Earl must be very expensive, at least 30 to 50,000 pounds. But it doesn't matter, he can apply to Duke Olmer, as long as he is the first to reach the area where the Undead Legion is located in the Tortured Forest, he can get rewarded again. According to Mr. World, this is called opening the map. And the Undead Legion is the first real Lord of Cinder encountered during the map opening process. As long as he can open the map first, Duke Olmer will definitely not mind giving him some material rewards. If he can still save a lot of money, maybe he can buy a few more dolls and dress them in new clothes. Emlyn unconsciously straightened his back and walked more proudly. Can't I come? Emlyn retorted and sat down in an empty seat without being polite. Casimir's expression was a little strange, of course he could come. In fact, all the Sanguine who entered the dream world these days would rest in this villa, which was convenient for their activities. But Emlyn was an exception. He went to the Harvest Church as a volunteer during the day, and ate dinner at home with his dolls, never with them. But this time, the other party actually came early and wanted to have dinner with them. What wind blew him out? Although Emlyn's words were a little blunt, Casimir didn't care, and smiled. I don't mind, you can come if you want. He clapped his hands, signaling the servant to bring another set of tableware. Chapter 312, Knowledge Church. With Emlyn's participation, the atmosphere at the dinner table was noticeably less lively than before. After all, the Sanguine have always prided themselves on their elegance and nobility, and have been proud of this for thousands of years. Even if they considered Emlyn a disgrace to the Sanguine, they wouldn't openly mock him in front of him. There was no evening party planned tonight, so shortly after dinner, led by Casimir, they skillfully followed the stairs down to the underground area, passed through layers of secret doors, and arrived at the iron-gray yet fresh and dripping hall. In the center of the hall was a vibrant tomb, surrounded by a circle of beds woven from green grass, 12 in total. Corresponding to the 12 Sanguine. Your Grace. The young Sanguine, including Emlyn, all bowed respectfully. Emlyn stood there and heard a rich voice from inside the tomb ask. Since you are here, let's begin. Yes. The Sanguine had no complaints, and lowered their heads to walk to their respective beds, and lie down. Emlyn also slowly approached his bed, but his heart couldn't help but be filled with turbulent waves. Because he was absolutely certain that Ember was right beside him. He couldn't see him because his strength was insufficient. But Duke Olmer was an angel. He didn't react at all. Could it be that even he didn't detect Ember? Doesn't that mean Ember's strength is even above Duke Olmer's? Above Sequence 2, could he be a Sequence 1 angel? That is the existence closest to a true god. Emlyn swallowed with difficulty. He knew Ember was strong, but he didn't expect him to be this strong. A Sequence 1 angel, even within the Sanguine, there is only one, and that is the beauty goddess Ornia, an existence second only to the blood ancestor. As for the possibility of Ember being a true god, Emlyn didn't even dare to think about it. After all, how could that be possible? It is said that the gods of the fifth epoch cannot walk in the human world, and this is indeed the case. Although the gods of the Orthodox churches occasionally transmit oracles, they have never truly appeared, and their will has always been conveyed by the triple crown of the major churches. If Ember were truly a god, then he should also be unable to walk in the human world due to some restriction, just like other gods. Emlyn's mind was in turmoil, but his body honestly lay down on the bed. He didn't want others to see his inner panic and unease, especially Duke Olmer. When all the sanguine were lying on the beds, a peculiar fragrance began to spread throughout the hall. Emlyn knew it was incense made by Duke Olmer to help them fall asleep quickly. After all, as Beander creatures, and nocturnal ones at that, the sanguine didn't need much sleep and were quite unaccustomed to sleeping at night. Although most of them could adjust to this, it was naturally best to have the help of incense. Just like now, unconsciously, all the sanguine had entered dreamland, entering that mysterious and unpredictable dream world. 1 second, Emlyn was still guessing when Ember would appear. The next second, when he came to his senses, he found himself sitting by a bonfire. The bonfire was located at the end of a dilapidated bridge. Opposite the bridge was an open iron gate leading to a sewer filled with rats. And not far in front of the bonfire, there were patrolling monsters. Forget it, that's not something I should consider. Emlyn shook his head. Whatever happened between Ember and Duke Olmer, he had no right to interfere. What he needed to do now was to quickly explore the map and go to the Frank fortress mentioned by World. When all the sanguine entered the dream, the iron-gray hall fell completely silent. The vibrant tomb no longer made any sound, just like an ordinary tomb. Until footsteps broke the silent atmosphere, a figure voluntarily appeared from concealment and walked to the tomb. A rich voice, indistinguishable in age, came from the tomb again. "You're finally here." Olmer's tone was full of emotion. "Thousands of years have passed, I thought I would never see you again in this lifetime." Ember was slightly surprised. "Thousands of years have passed, and you still remember." The tombstone in front of the tomb moved to the right, revealing a passage that could accommodate one person. A handsome young man with dazzling golden hair walked out, his expression somewhat complex, and he smiled bitterly. "How could I forget? Let alone thousands of years, even if tens of thousands of years pass, I won't forget." Although it was something that happened thousands of years ago, even now, the events of that day are still vivid. On that day, in Landenheim, in the most glorious city of the Sanguine, his father, the god of the Sanguine, the god of life, fell in his own castle, and at the same time, another god fell, that Crimson Moon. And with their fall, Lilith truly entered the historical stage. She became a true ancient god, a genuine blood ancestor. And the person who caused all of this was Ember. He killed the god of life, ended that Crimson Moon, and he also helped Lilith ascend to the divine position. Even Olmer's current position is thanks to Ember. Although Ember killed his father, he also gave him the opportunity to advance to demigod. To be honest, Olmer was even grateful to Ember at one point. After all, if Ember hadn't killed the god of life, killed his father, he probably would never have had the chance to become a demigod in his lifetime, and even less would he have the chance to become one of the 3 great dukes of the Sanguine as he is now. But this person who caused a great change in the Sanguine and helped the Sanguine give birth to an ancient god disappeared without a trace after that. Including the blood ancestor and the beauty goddess, the entire Sanguine had tried to find traces of his existence. But in the past few thousand years, the Sanguine found nothing, as if this person never existed in this world, and what happened in Landenheim was just a legend, a dream. But Olmer, who had personally experienced all this and had been in contact with Lilith and Ember, didn't think so. Although he had never found traces of Ember's existence, he had always been in awe of Ember, even though Ember had been missing for thousands of years. After all, this was an existence that could kill gods thousands of years ago. In the second epoch, everyone believed that the blood ancestor, the destruction magic wolf, and the king of variants who fell in the Age of Fire's first radiance were the earliest fallen gods. But only the Sanguine knew that a god had already completely fallen even before the birth of the 8 ancient gods. In the historical records of the Sanguine, it was the fall of that moon god that truly ushered in the era of the 8 ancient gods. Because of the fall of the moon, the first ancient god of the second epoch was born, which was the blood ancestor. Before Lilith ascended to the divine position, the Sanguine were the weakest among all Beander races, because they had neither true gods nor enough angels. Compared to other Beander races that had at least multiple angels, the Sanguine only had one god of life. And when the god of life fell and Lilith was the first to ascend to the divine position, the Sanguine leapt to become the most powerful Beander race, bar none. Whether it was giants or dragons, they could only bow their heads before the Sanguine. Even though existences like the Dragon of Imagination and Giant King Ormir ascended to the divine position one after another later, their strength was far inferior to the Blood Ancestor. Among the 8 ancient gods of the second epic, the Blood Ancestor was the strongest god, bar none. Even if betrayed and framed, the Blood Ancestor could take the destruction magic wolf and the King of Variants down with her, which is the best proof. But all this is ultimately in the past. The glory of the Sanguine vanished with the fall of the Blood Ancestor, and the Sanguine after that became like stray dogs. Without the protection of gods, the Sanguine could only hide among humans and eke out a living. Even if some Sanguine defected to the elves under the leadership of his sister, the goddess of life, life under someone else's roof was far from stable. Ulmer was once extremely puzzled. He didn't understand why Ember had helped the Blood Ancestor ascend to the divine position, and why he had watched the Blood Ancestor fall in betrayal, while he himself never appeared from beginning to end. And now, when Ember appeared before him, he really wanted to ask why all this was. But after a complex psychological struggle, Ulmer ultimately wisely chose to remain silent. This question should not be asked by him, nor was he qualified to ask it. Ulmer cleared his thoughts and took the initiative to ask. "What do you need me to do?" Ember inquired. "Where is Ornia now?" "I don't know." Ulmer shook his head and said. "I know the locations of the 3 great dukes of the Sanguine. I stay in Backland, one stays in Trier, the capital of the Intis Republic, and another stays in Fenboot, the capital of the Fainapotter Kingdom. You should be very familiar with these 2. The one in Trier is my sister, Alyssa, who is also the former goddess of life of the Sanguine. And another one." Ulmer hesitated, his emotions somewhat complex. "And another is Elena, you've also met her." At that time, she was still Alyssa's servant. Ulmer's feelings were quite complicated. Among the 4 angels of the Sanguine, he was the only male. And the other 3 had all interacted with Ember before. Ornia is Lilith's sister, and also Ember's sister. And Alyssa and Elena had both met Ember that night. It is truly hard not to suspect that the reason why these 3 were able to become angels was all thanks to Ember, just like the Blood Ancestor. The most typical example is Elena. She was once just an ordinary human, not even a Sanguine. But she received the Blood Ancestor's first embrace and instantly became a true demigod, on equal footing with Ulmer. But Ulmer had nothing to say about this. After all, if you really think about it, he was actually also thanks to Ember. If he hadn't been friendly when he contacted Ember and the others back then, his fate would probably have been the same as his brother whose name he had already forgotten, not even being able to piece together a complete corpse. Of course, even if Ulmer wanted to say something now, it would be useless. After all, among the Sanguine who experienced all this back then, only the 4 of them are left. Other Sanguine, even if they didn't die in wars with other Beander races, have already died of old age naturally. After all, although the lifespan of the Sanguine is long, if they cannot become angels, there is still a limit. Ordinary Sanguine only live for 200 or 300 years, while Sequence 4 demigods can only live for over 1,000 years. What happened thousands of years ago, even for the Sanguine, is just a distant legend. Even if Ulmer is a duke, if he were to declare to all the Sanguine that the rise of the Sanguine was due to a human, and the reason why the 4 current angels of the Sanguine could become angels is also due to that human, there would absolutely not be many Sanguine who would believe him. Even if other Sanguine dared not say much out of awe, they would definitely feel in their hearts that Ulmer's mind might be a little off. As his thoughts flowed, Ulmer continued. There are almost no Sanguine in the Faesac Empire, firstly because of their size, it is difficult for the Sanguine to hide themselves. Moreover, the relationship between giants and Sanguine has always been not very harmonious, and their attitude towards the Sanguine is not very friendly. Once discovered, they will be treated as heretics. Among the remaining 3 great kingdoms, I and the other 2 dukes are each responsible for one country, handling the Sanguine affairs of that country. Lady Ornia basically doesn't manage things and rarely appears, only occasionally transmitting oracles. So, including us 3 dukes, no one knows where Lady Ornia is. However, I guess Lady Ornia should be in Leuenberg now. Ember thought for a moment and asked. Why? Ulmer said straightforwardly. There is some in-depth cooperation between the Sanguine and the Knowledge Church. This part of the cooperation is handled by the Sanguine in Leuenberg, and even the 3 great dukes have no room to interfere. But with just a few local demigods, they obviously do not have enough qualifications to be responsible for the cooperation with the Knowledge Church. This part of the matter can only be directly decided by Lady Ornia. Pausing, Ulmer pointed to the Sanguine outside the tomb and continued. For example, that dream world, that is a cooperation with the Knowledge Church, and it is an oracle personally issued by Lady Ornia. Knowledge Church. Ember was slightly surprised, because the dream world was created by Karula, and the Sanguine were the explorers and participants of the dream world. He originally thought this was a cooperation between the Sanguine and Karula, but he didn't expect there to be a Knowledge Church in between. But the question is, why involve the Knowledge Church? Karula creates the dream, and the Sanguine are responsible for exploring. What about the Knowledge Church? What role did they play in it? If it's just simply responsible for exploration, there's no need to specifically find the Knowledge Church. After all, any Beander can enter the dream world. The first batch of Sanguine entering is like internal testing, experimenting whether the dream world can operate stably. But the entry of the Tarot Club members, and the subsequent entry of the Hall family's Beyonders into the dream world, means that the dream world can be publicly tested, to a certain extent. Coupled with the characteristic of the dream world itself that can help digest potion, once it spreads, it will definitely attract a large number of Beyonders. Since that's the case, there's absolutely no need to specifically cooperate with an Orthodox church, let alone the weakest Knowledge Church among the Orthodox churches, unless the Knowledge Church plays some important role in it. Ember thought for a moment and then asked, do the Sanguine have any clues about demigods of the Seer, Marauder, and Apprentice pathways? Ulmer thought for a moment and said, I will have the Sanguine in Backland help keep an eye out. Pausing, Ulmer asked again, how should I contact you? Ulmer's eyes flickered. He hoped to use this opportunity to learn Ember's honorific name. That was something he had wanted to know thousands of years ago. Ember saw through Ulmer's thoughts, but his answer was simple. You can pray to the Fool. Chapter 313, Preparation for the Ritual. At dawn, in the Iron Grey Hall, Emlyn and the other Sanguine woke up on time. Emlyn looked around blankly, it seemed nothing had happened here. Before him was that vibrant tomb, and the hall showed no signs of damage. This made him wonder if Ember had come or not during the time he was in the dream world. Just as Emlyn's thoughts were racing, a rich voice came from the vibrant tomb. Have you made any new progress in your exploration of the dream world? Cassimi and the other Sanguine subconsciously turned their gaze towards Emlyn White. Although they usually mocked him as the shame of the Sanguine, they had to admit that in the process of exploring the dream world, Emlyn White was the fastest. Emlyn collected his thoughts and respectfully replied, Duke Ulmer, I have left the Undead settlement and arrived at the Sacrificial Offering Road. Emlyn recounted his experiences during the exploration, including the knight Igor, who claimed to be from Callum and had been guarding the cage. According to him, there should have been a saint in the cage, but she had long since disappeared, seemingly taken away by other undead. Besides that, there was the giant on the tower, fighting alongside the Onion Knight, killing the Flame Devil. Emlyn recounted his experiences truthfully, but kept silent about the strategy obtained from Mr. World. Emlyn subtly raised his chin slightly, saying in a tone that seemed ashamed but was actually showing off. I'm very sorry, Duke Ulmer, I have just arrived at the Sacrificial Offering Road and know very little about this area. Duke Ulmer gave a soft, Well done, what reward do you need? Cassimi and the other Sanguine couldn't help but cast complex glances at Emlyn, mostly envy and a hint of indescribable jealousy. Many of them were already Viscounts, but their progress was not even as fast as Emlyn, who was a Baron, and was even far behind. This led to Emlyn always being the first to go to a new area, and often the first to receive rewards from Duke Ulmer. The first to defeat Gouda and reach the High Wall of Lothric. The first to kill Bordeaux and reach the Undead settlement. And this time, the first to clear the Undead settlement and reach the Sacrificial Offering Road. Emlyn wasn't being overly polite and said seriously. Preferably pounds. Ulmer chuckled. Okay, go to Cassimi and advance 5,000 pounds. Emlyn was overjoyed, because the Viscount Beander characteristic promised by Mr. Lover was exactly 8,000 pounds. When he bought the Baron Beander characteristic last time, he still had about 2,000 pounds in cash, but most of it had been used to buy new dolls and clothes for them, leaving not much. And the rewards he received 3 times in a row gave him a total of 10,000 pounds in cash. And even if this money was used to buy the Viscount's Beander characteristic, he would still have 2,000 pounds left, perfect. Of course, even with the Viscount's Beander characteristic, it doesn't mean he can be promoted immediately. He needs to first complete the digestion of the Baron potion, but that's not a problem, as the dream world can speed up this process. The digestion of a sequence 6 potion only requires 100,000 souls, and Emlyn had already digested 100,000 souls and completed the potion digestion when he defeated Gouda. For the current Emlyn, being a Viscount is no longer anything, his goal is to be an Earl. If the digestion of a sequence 6 potion requires 100,000 souls, then the digestion of a sequence 5 potion would probably require 1 million souls. And counting the remaining 200,000 souls from Gouda, as well as the cursed rotted greetwood from the undead settlement he killed later, plus the small monsters killed along the way, he already had over 800,000 souls. As long as he can kill the crystallization elder on the sacrificial offering road, as mentioned by Mr. World, he can complete the digestion of the sequence 5 potion in one go. By then, as long as he obtains the sequence 4 Beander characteristic from Lover, he can become an Earl. Emlyn was in high spirits. It wouldn't be long before he could become a true demigod, towering over most sanguine. By then, everyone would have to call him Lord Emlyn White. He wanted all those sanguine who dared to mock him to go to the Harvest Church and volunteer. Bokrenland Street 1, Don Tance's mansion. Upon entering the house, Klein first saw a foyer, which was very spacious, with many chairs and umbrella stands, and was elegantly decorated and well furnished. If he hadn't known the structure beforehand and inspected the site, Klein would have even thought it was a reception room. Through the second large door, his eyes suddenly opened up, revealing a hall large enough for dozens or even hundreds of guests to dance. In the center of this hall was a brightly colored, thick, and soft carpet, surrounded by bright and clear marble floor tiles, with items such as pianos and stone sculptures, and columns inlaid with decorations supporting the second floor. To the left was a row of floor-to-ceiling windows, outside of which was a verdant lawn and a blooming garden. To the right were walls, wooden doors, and a corridor leading to the lounge, storage room, washroom, kitchen, and butler's room, among other places. The hall was 2 stories high, with crystal chandeliers hanging from the ceiling, allowing one to immediately imagine what it would look like at night. Walking to the end, there were stairs on both sides leading to the second floor. The corridor here was square, and the empty space in the center was exactly where the carpet was laid in the hall. Klein could easily enjoy the ball below by holding a glass of wine and standing behind the railing on the second floor. The second floor had many rooms, including a living room, a sitting room, a dining room, a washroom, a billiard room, and a large number of bedrooms. If guests needed to stay overnight, they would live here. Similarly, there were 2 staircases on the second floor leading to the third floor, which was where Dantonce lived. It had an exaggerated master bedroom, a semi-open room with a bar where one could enjoy the sun and scenery, a study that was almost a small library, 2 dressing rooms and small bedrooms for the valet and night maid respectively, as well as rooms and washrooms for family members, although Klein was currently single. As for the other servants, they were in the row of single-story houses behind the main building, and in the other direction was the stable. The basement of the building was also spacious, with a large storage room and a wine cellar. Having taken off his coat, Klein stood with a straight back on the large balcony of the semi-open room on the third floor, looking at the scenery of the surrounding streets, and couldn't help but sigh in his heart. Expensive is indeed meaningful. The £315 in rent wasn't too much of a waste. He had paid a year's rent yesterday afternoon and could only force himself to find the place more and more pleasing to the eye. Klein felt a tremendous heartache, regretting even more why he had chosen the identity of a merchant in the first place. Because his fixed expenses for renting this villa and employing servants alone amounted to £885 per year. This didn't include the cost of providing food, clothing, and various daily necessities. But fortunately, the identity of Dantonce could be used for a long time. And these expenses might not be without return, as he could fully utilize Dantonce's identity to contact the upper nobility of the Loan Kingdom and thereby find opportunities to compensate for these losses. And if he couldn't make up for the losses within this year, Klein could only change his identity again. As he relaxed, there was a knock on the door, and his valet Richardson said, Miss Vahana Heisen is here." Upon hearing this, Klein put down the newspaper, raised his head, and glanced at his valet. A quarter of an hour later, he embraced his etiquette teacher, Vahana Heisen, and began to learn a dance commonly used in social occasions. "I feel like I'll be out of a job in a few days." After a while, Vahana subtly praised Dantonce's progress and finally said, "But you are still a bit stiff. Although you don't need to stick as closely to ladies as Intis men do, you don't have to always maintain a certain distance. Occasional contact is normal. You are too stiff and rigid like this." Klein pulled the other party closer and replied with a smile, "I am afraid of being rude. Does this mean that getting too close to a lady is rude? Does it also imply that I am very charming and he would make a fool of himself if he got too close?" This is subtle flattery. Vahana's thoughts turned, and she smiled shallowly. "You are learning well." During the lesson, Klein's butler, Walter, suddenly knocked on the door. After being granted permission, he entered the room and said to Klein, "Mister, a gentleman named Ash Black has come to visit." Upon hearing this, Klein looked apologetically at Vahana. "Sorry, madam, let's stop here for today." Vahana smiled shallowly. "It's okay, it's your freedom. After seeing Vahana off, Klein turned to the butler and said, "Please invite Mr. Aishu to the study." Walter respectfully withdrew, and Klein also got up and went to the study, walking at a steady pace to the back of the desk and sitting down. After a while, there was a knock on the door from outside. After receiving a response, butler Walter opened the study door and respectfully said, Mr. Aishu is here." Klein nodded slightly. He didn't look at Ember next to him, but instructed, "Walter, find out what trouble Miss Vahana has encountered. If she can't solve it, we will provide timely assistance." "Yes, Mr." Walter respectfully exited the room, closing the door behind him. Ember sat opposite Klein and asked, "Is there something you need to see me about suddenly?" Klein asked, "How many demigods from those 3 pathways have you found?" Ember pondered for 2 seconds and said, "The Saint of Mysteries of the Aurora Order is a secret sorcerer. I have already negotiated with the Aurora Order, and they will find a way to have him come to Backland in the near future." Klein silently mourned for the Saint of Mysteries for 2 seconds in his heart, and after organizing his thoughts, he said, "I have asked Rhodes for information about the demigods of these 3 pathways. The number of demigods of the Apprentice pathway and the Marauder pathway is extremely small, less than 10 in the entire North Continent. The former mostly come from the Tamara family, and the latter mostly come from the Jacob family. As for the Bizarro Sorcerer, although the number of existing Bizarro Sorcerers is larger, almost all of them belong to the Hermetic Order. And the Hermetic Order seems to have undergone some changes recently, causing the Bizarro Sorcerers who were originally in Backland to leave in a hurry and go to remote areas, making them difficult to find. As an all-knowing, magic mirror, Rhodes is very useful. But no matter how useful a sealed artifact is, it will have its limitations. For Klein, the limitation of Rhodes is not that he must answer a question from it while asking it a question, because this magic mirror will thoughtfully ask questions such as, "My dear master, have you eaten today?" The real limitation is that although one can learn the locations of those seer, marauder, and door pathway demigods by asking Rhodes, these demigods are not dead, they will not stay in the same place forever waiting for Ember to come to their door. Moreover, although these demigods cannot detect Rhodes's peep, some demigods occasionally receive a spiritual warning and quickly escape the current area. On the other hand, beyonders of these 3 pathways are all extremely good at concealment. The Bizarro Sorcerer of the Seer pathway has advanced versions of the Faceless and Marionettist abilities and is difficult to find once they enter a crowd. The Secret Sorcerer of the Apprentice pathway has the ability to teleport and can teleport thousands of miles away if they sense something is wrong. Although Klein doesn't know much about the Beyonders of the Marauder pathway, he knows that the sequence 4 demigod of this pathway is called a parasite, and they can completely parasitize ordinary people, making them difficult to detect. Just like the poet classmate, he is parasitized by an angel of the Marauder pathway, whose concealment ability even the Evernight goddess could not detect. In other words, to lock onto the location of these demigods using Rhodes must constantly monitor them. But this is impossible. Because Rhodes attracts the attention of certain existences every time it appears, Klein does not dare to use Rhodes for a long time, and each time he asks it a question, it does not exceed 2 minutes. And by the time these 2 minutes are over, those demigods have already disappeared without a trace. Therefore, Klein can only determine the location of these demigods through Rhodes and then track their whereabouts in reality. Klein explained the reason in detail, and then said, "The bad news is that there is only one demigod in the entire Backland area who meets the criteria." After a pause, Klein smiled again. "The good news is that this demigod is not in a good state, and I have already obtained his specific information." Ember's expression moved slightly. If he included the Saint of Mysteries of the Aurora Order, he had now gathered 2 demigods. The only problem now is where to find the Bizarro Sorcerer of the Seer pathway. However, there is no need to rush, as the Sanguine have agreed to help find them. With the Sanguine's network of contacts built up over thousands of years, this should not be a difficult task. Chapter 314, The Dinner Party. Saturday night, 8 p.m. Klein instructed his butler Walter to prepare a high-class carriage, and together with Ember, who had just arrived, they took the carriage to Member of Parliament Mock's house at Bokrenland Street number 39. "Would you like something to drink?" Klein asked Ember, who was sitting opposite him. There was a small bar in the carriage, stocked with spirits like Jinlangchi and Winter Blackland prepared by butler Walter, as well as various red and white wines sourced from Intis. Ember gave Klein a strange look and said, "Black tea." Hearing this, Klein personally poured him a cup of black tea with lemon slices. Richardson, the valet standing nearby, hesitated to speak, as this kind of task should have been done by a servant like him. Ember took a sip of the black tea and suddenly asked curiously. How much did this carriage cost? Klein shrugged and said, if I bought it, it would cost around £300. Unfortunately, I rented it, so it only cost £88. His expression showed no abnormality, as his valet Richardson was still there. And given the image of a wealthy man he had cultivated, he should not appear too stingy in front of servants, as that would affect his reputation among his neighbors. However, it only took less than 10 minutes to walk from his house to Member of Parliament Mock's house. If it weren't for the sake of appearances and having already rented a carriage and hired a driver, Klein would actually prefer to walk, to digest food and strengthen his body. Taking 2.5 minutes, the carriage smoothly arrived at Member of Parliament Mock's house at Beaucrenland Street number 39. Looking at the splashing fountain reflecting the lights, Klein buttoned his tailcoat formal wear as he stepped out of the carriage and walked slowly towards the main entrance of the house. Richardson held a beautifully packaged bottle of South Wales red wine and followed closely behind his employer and his friend, not daring to overstep by half a step. Upon entering the gate, Klein immediately saw Member of Parliament Maury Mock and his wife Liana coming to greet them. The former was wearing an olive green army officer's uniform with an orange-red sash, and several medals were pinned to his chest. In the Ruined Kingdom, active or retired military officers liked to wear military uniforms at balls. The latter wore a long, yellow dress with no collar, featuring many ruffles and little delicate lace, different from unmarried ladies, but it also revealed her fair neck and half of her shoulder. Klein took the bottle of South Wales red wine from his valet Richardson, handed it to Member of Parliament Mock, and then bowed, saying, "My apologies, we are a few minutes late." This was actually a common situation at ruin banquets. Guests would rather be a little late than early, because the host might still be busy with the final preparations for the banquet, and it was not appropriate to receive guests at such a time. Of course, being late should also be kept within 10 minutes as much as possible. If Vahana hadn't specifically taught him this common sense, Klein would definitely have arrived politely early. It's all right, the ball hasn't officially started yet. Mock glanced at the South Wales red wine in his hand, and while handing it to his valet, he smiled and nodded. In Ruin's upper-class social circles, when attending a party held by someone for the first time, one must present the host with a small gift. Among these, alcoholic beverages are the most popular, but it is important to remember that for the first time, a domestic product must be chosen. After greeting the host, Klein looked at Liana. Seeing her slightly raise her right hand, he stepped forward, took her hand, and bowed to lightly kiss it, saying, "Your radiance illuminates the entire ball." Before the banquet begins, compliments to the host are one of the few areas in Ruin social settings where subtlety is not required. Unlike Intis, in Ruin, the hand-kissing gesture must be initiated by the lady before the gentleman can proceed, otherwise, it is a serious breach of etiquette. "Your arrival does the same," Liana replied with a smile. Member of Parliament Mock looked at Ember beside Klein and asked curiously, "And this gentleman is?" The other party's attire and appearance clearly didn't resemble a servant, especially since Don Tangte had already brought a valet, so this person could only be a friend of Don Tangte. But the question was, hadn't Don Tangte only been in Backland for a short time? Had he made a friend so quickly? Klein smiled and introduced, "Viscount Ash Black. He is from Backland, but I met him once in South Wales County." Viscount. Member of Parliament Mock's eyes immediately changed, and he proactively extended his hand to Ember, saying enthusiastically, "Welcome, Viscount Black." "Thank you." Ember politely shook his hand, then smiled and said, "But I must correct you, I am not from Backland, I am from Winter County, and I have only been in Backland for less than a year." Member of Parliament Mock's expression subtly changed, and a hint of understanding flashed in his eyes. Although he was only a Member of Parliament and did not have his own title, given his status as a Member of Parliament, he was quite familiar with the upper nobility of Ruin. In his sphere of influence, there seemed to be no figure known as Viscount Black. But if he was from Winter County, then perhaps that could explain why he hadn't been prominent before. Moreover, a Viscount from Winter County meant that he had a close relationship with the Church of the Night. As for whether he was a real Viscount, there was no doubt about that. The noble demeanor of this Viscount Black could not be faked. Furthermore, Don Tangte had no reason to tell such an easily exposed lie. It would only ruin his reputation among his neighbors and make it difficult for him to establish himself in the North District, or even in Backland. Member of Parliament Mock glanced at Klein, and saw that he was displaying an awkward but polite smile, clearly unaware that this Viscount Black was from Winter County, and was feeling awkward about his incorrect introduction. This was enough to show that their relationship was not very close. Perhaps, as Don Tangte said, they had only met once. Of course, the fact that he could invite a viscount, and that this viscount was willing to accept his invitation, also showed that their relationship was definitely not limited to just a one-time meeting. Thinking of this, Member of Parliament Mocked immediately changed the subject to make Don Tangte less awkward. Viscount Black, are you married? Ember shook his head and said. Not yet. Member of Parliament Mocked's eyes immediately lit up, and he exchanged glances with his wife. The couple then led Klein and Ember through the porch into the main hall, where a melodious tune was already echoing. Walking a few steps forward, Mori Mocked pointed to a young girl in a sky blue long dress and said. My daughter, Hazel. This is Don Tangte, our new neighbor. Klein looked towards the young girl and smiled and nodded. He knew this girl, to be precise, he had seen her image in the mirror that Erodes had transformed into. He had once inquired about the whereabouts of a marauder pathway demigod, and one scene showed an arrogant young girl wandering in the sewers, and this was Hazel Mocked standing before him, a young lady with long, dark green wavy hair and deep brown, bright eyes. He did not see the true face of that demigod in the sewer, and due to time constraints, he could not ask Erodes for more details, but that demigod was likely parasitizing this Miss Hazel, just like his poet classmate. This could also explain why Miss Hazel suddenly became a Beyonder, as the status of her parents was not yet sufficient to extensively cultivate Beyonders. As for her wandering in the sewers, perhaps it was at the request of that demigod. And the reason Klein brought Ember to attend Member of Parliament Mocked's dinner party was to meet Miss Hazel. Klein instantly thought of many questions, but on the surface, he calmly bowed with his hand on his chest and said, Good evening, Miss Hazel. During this process, he quietly glanced at Hazel Mocked's face, and noticed that the young girl's expression was calm, her eyes arrogant, and she only responded with a polite smile. Good evening, Don Tangte. Member of Parliament Mocked continued, pointing to Ember, and said, This is Viscount Black. A hint of surprise appeared in Hazel's eyes, and she softly said, Good evening, Viscount Ash Black. Mocked nodded with a very satisfied expression. The reason he had asked Ember if he was married earlier was both to help Don Tangte out of an awkward situation and to ask for his daughter. His daughter was quite arrogant and completely looked down on boys her age, evaluating them as either too childish or having achieved nothing. Don Tangte was an excellent gentleman, but unfortunately, he was too old, otherwise he would have been a good match. And now, the friend he had invited, Viscount Black, was undoubtedly a better choice. Not only was he the same age as Hazel, but he was already a viscount at such a young age, with boundless prospects. If he could bring them together, it would be a good thing for both Hazel and the family. Klein took a glass of pale golden champagne from the tray held by a nearby waiter and turned to converse with Member of Parliament Mori Mocked. I didn't expect you to have been a major, Member of Parliament. He could tell this from Member of Parliament Mocked's epaulets. If the other party had been a colonel, Klein would have suspected that this gentleman was also a Beyonder, but it was hard to say for a major. Haha, that's nothing. There are too many opportunities to achieve merit in East Balam. Mori Mocked replied modestly, of course, the climate there is also very uncomfortable. I have been suggesting to the Army High Command to design special military uniforms for East and West Balan, getting rid of the traditional dark colors, otherwise the officers will feel like beef on a grill. As for the soldiers, their uniforms were mostly red on top and white below. Yes, the climate there is completely different from back home. Even Dissy Bay is not that hot. Klein subtly indicated that he had been to the South Continent, to one of the East or West Balan, which corroborated the hunting experience he had mentioned a few days ago. While exchanging pleasantries, the two implicitly moved away from the scene, preparing to leave time for the two young people. Member of Parliament Mocked intended to bring together Viscount Black and his daughter, but it ultimately depended on his daughter's wishes. And Klein thought the same. He wanted Ember to get close to Hazel to see if he could find an opportunity to eliminate that demigod without alarming anyone else. Hazel shifted her gaze from her parents, who were chatting happily with Don Tangte, looked at the young man beside her, and suddenly asked, Viscount Black, you don't seem to be a local of Backland. Ember took a glass of red wine from the tray held by the waiter and gently nodded. I am from Winter County. Winter County. A hint of surprise flashed in Hazel's eyes, along with a hidden trace of unease. Her parents were devout believers of the Church of the Night, otherwise they would not have chosen to settle in the North District, and Bishop Electra from St. Samuel Cathedral often visited them. Hazel herself also believed in the Church of the Night, just not as devoutly as her parents. The most important reason was that she had her own little secret. And Winter County happened to be the main base of the Church of the Night. So, could this Viscount Black before her also be a Beyonder? As she was feeling uneasy, the young girl suddenly heard a gentle voice from behind. Viscount Ash Black, long time no see. Hazel subconsciously turned her head. Behind her was a clergyman wearing a double-breasted black robe and his female companion. The clergyman appeared to be around 40 years old, with deep blue eyes and a thin face. His features were not particularly handsome, but he inexplicably felt pleasant to look at. Hazel knew him. He was Bishop Electra, a clergyman from St. Samuel Cathedral. It was not unusual for this bishop to visit their home frequently. Most members of parliament and nobles had bishops who visited them regularly, and those with high status, even Archbishop St. Anthony would visit them personally. But what was happening now clearly made Hazel feel that it was out of the ordinary. Ember looked at the bishop walking towards him, smiled and raised his glass in greeting, half-jokingly saying, "Bishop Electra, I believe we only met last month." Electra was slightly startled, then said helplessly, "Viscount Ash Black, you must know that compared to believers who go to church for prayer every week, not seeing each other for a month is already a long time." Saying this, Bishop Electra introduced his female companion beside him. "My wife, Shauna Johnson. This is Viscount Ash Black, he is also a devout believer of the goddess." Shauna Johnson greeted him politely, and Ember also responded politely. Just then, Member of Parliament Mocked suddenly walked over and asked curiously, "Bishop Electra, did you know each other before? We've met a few times." Bishop Electra smiled and said, "Last month, Viscount Ash Black came to St. Samuel Cathedral to visit Archbishop St. Anthony, but since Archbishop St. Anthony was not at the church at the time, I was responsible for receiving Viscount Ash Black." Mocked's breath hitched, because he suddenly realized that he had still underestimated Ember's identity. Originally, Bishop Electra only said, "met a few times," and he thought they were just ordinary believer and bishop relationship. But the other party's address changed his view. A bishop of the Church of the Night would not address a believer of the night as Viscount Ash Black. This meant that Viscount Black's status was at least equal to Bishop Electra, or even above him. And the latter sentence made Member of Parliament Mocked even more incredulous. What did it mean to visit Archbishop St. Anthony? Chapter 315, All Acquaintances. Those who knew were aware that St. Anthony was a demigod, one of the few demigods in Backland. At least, there were no more than 5 demigods officially affiliated with Backland on the surface. Those who didn't know were also aware that St. Anthony was the Archbishop of St. Samuel Cathedral and the overall head of the entire Backland diocese. Within the entire Backland area, all members of the Church of the Night were under his jurisdiction. It was no exaggeration to say that, to some extent, Archbishop St. Anthony's influence and appeal even surpassed that of the royal family. Member of Parliament Mocked was almost certain that once the Church of the Night and the royal family came into conflict, the vast majority of the populace would undoubtedly and unhesitatingly stand on the side of the Church of the Night. After all, the royal family were merely rulers, while the Church of the Night was a faith. Under the immense influence of the Church of the Night, Archbishop St. Anthony's status, while not equivalent to the king, was at least above that of a prince. Member of Parliament Mocked's family were devout followers of the Night. However, when they went to St. Samuel Cathedral to pray, they were only received by Bishop Electra. As for Archbishop St. Anthony, only nobles of marquis or even duke rank were qualified to meet him. Similarly, just as Bishop Electra periodically visited their home, Archbishop St. Anthony also periodically visited those high-ranking nobles. These nobles were either dukes or marquises, or if not, they were top-tier nobles like Earl Hall, whose title might not be high but whose influence and status were equivalent to that of a duke. And now, according to Bishop Electra, Ember was also a noble qualified to proactively visit Archbishop St. Anthony. Didn't that mean his status and influence were equivalent to those marquises and even dukes? Member of Parliament Mocked didn't dare to be too obvious, only subtly using his peripheral vision to observe Ember beside him, his heart churning with turbulent waves. His title is only Viscount, yet he is on par with marquises and dukes. Either his family, like Earl Hall's, possesses strong economic power, with total assets amounting to tens of millions of pounds. But this possibility is low. If that were the case, such a figure would not be unknown in Backland. Then there is only one other possibility: his family has held high positions for generations. I've never heard of this person in the House of Lords or the House of Commons, and this Viscount Black is from Winter County. This means that his family holds a high position in the Church of the Night, and perhaps a senior deacon or even an archbishop of the Church of the Night is a member of his family. Member of Parliament Mocked had already made a guess in his heart, but this guess did not bring him joy. Instead, it brought some worry. Frankly speaking, the status of a member of Parliament in the House of Commons was actually far inferior to that of a noble. Most nobles were hereditary; their descendants could naturally inherit their father's title. As long as they did not commit fundamental errors such as treason or rebellion, this inheritance could continue until the ruined kingdom fell, truly meaning they shared the country's fate. Similarly, most nobles could naturally obtain seats in the House of Lords, and these seats were also almost hereditary. The House of Commons, on the other hand, was the complete opposite. The initial proposal for two houses was actually to win over and appease commoners who had some property but no actual status. The House of Lords was responsible for deciding national affairs, while the House of Commons was responsible for proposing bills but had no decision-making power. In other words, the House of Commons was only responsible for making suggestions, and whether or not they were adopted depended on what the nobles in the House of Lords thought. Moreover, unlike the hereditary nobles in the House of Lords, the House of Commons was elected every 5 years. Many members of Parliament served for only 5 years because they were likely to be unable to compete with others. Of course, with the ascension of George III, this king had been intentionally suppressing the House of Lords and the nobles, strengthening the power of the House of Commons. It was clear to everyone that the king was worried about the nobles, power becoming too great and threatening the royal family, so he hoped to use the House of Commons to counterbalance the House of Lords. But to put it bluntly, the House of Commons was just a tool. Even if it seemed to have an opportunity to contend with the nobles in the House of Lords, this was only a temporary illusion. As expected, with the sudden death of George III at the beginning of the new year, the new King George IV naturally inherited the throne. Perhaps George IV was naturally close to the nobles, coupled with his young age and lack of political experience, or perhaps because George IV had just ascended the throne and his foundation was unstable, he urgently needed the support of the nobles. In short, this new king unhesitatingly abandoned the House of Commons. Not only did he restore the power of the House of Lords, but he also promised huge benefits to the nobles, while the House of Commons, in contrast, was suppressed and neglected. Most of the members of Parliament in the House of Commons who had responded to George III's call and openly challenged the nobles were purged. Member of Parliament Mocht, however, survived this purge because he came from the military and had intricate connections with the nobles, maintaining close relationships with them. In relying on the connections he had accumulated, Member of Parliament Mocht was confident that he could be re-elected. And with his status as a Member of Parliament in the House of Commons, Member of Parliament Mocht had always felt that his status was equivalent to that of a baron. Therefore, Member of Parliament Mocht believed that his daughter marrying a viscount was not marrying up. In fact, if the viscount's situation was somewhat down and out, he might even be able to help out a bit, which would be mutually beneficial. But in the current situation, Viscount Black was clearly not some down-and-out noble, but a powerful noble who could be ranked alongside the most prominent nobles. Can't afford to marry up. Member of Parliament Mocht sighed in his heart, his peripheral vision looking at his daughter, who was showing surprise and curiosity, feeling somewhat helpless. He only hoped now that it was still not too late, and that the brief conversation just now hadn't made Hazel fall for him. While Member of Parliament Mocht was observing Ember with his peripheral vision, Klein was also observing Member of Parliament Mocht with his peripheral vision. As a faceless, although Klein did not have the spectator's ability to see into hearts, he could see the change in Member of Parliament Mocht's attitude and somewhat understand his worries. However, this didn't matter, as their target had never been Miss Hazel, but the demigod behind her. Just then, a voice came from behind the group. "Your Lordship Bishop." Klein turned his head and saw two young men approaching them, holding champagne glasses. One of them wore a black trench coat, had black hair and green eyes, slightly long hair that was rarely styled, appearing messy and unrestrained, but possessing an unusual beauty. He had a remarkably good appearance, a handsome face comparable to a sanguine that could grace magazine covers, and the demeanor of a romantic poet. It was none other than his poet classmate, Leonard Mitchell. The other also had a remarkably striking appearance, with flaxen hair, deep brown eyes, a high nose bridge, and thin lips. Mobert Zoroaster, this was also an old acquaintance of Klein's. However, he was not dressed in the strange, asymmetrical aesthetic of the Fourth Epoch this time, but was properly wearing a black double-breasted suit, his proud demeanor naturally flowing. Klein suppressed the urge to cover his face. Why were they all acquaintances? He and Member of Parliament Mocht were neighbors, so attending this dinner party was natural. But why were the two of you here? Didn't one of you live on Pinstreet Street and the other on Pesfield Street? Although these two places were not far from Beaucrenland Street, they were definitely not neighbors. Who invited you? Klein subconsciously turned his gaze towards Bishop Electra. At the moment, only this bishop was the most suspicious. Bishop Electra did not disappoint, smiling as he introduced. "Let me introduce Leonard Mitchell, Mobet Soros. These two are devout believers of the goddess. Mr. Soros also recently arrived in Backland from the south. Perhaps Mr. Don Tangte, you know him." Klein smiled and raised his glass, saying, "Your Lordship Bishop, with all due respect, the south may not be as prosperous as Backland, but it is certainly much larger than Backland." Not everyone from the south is an acquaintance. Of course, he knew him. They had even hunted dragons and pirate generals together, and their startup capital was obtained from the Blood Admiral together. But in this setting, he would never admit it. After all, Leonard was also present, and he didn't want to be suspected. Of course, even if he was suspected, it didn't really matter. Anyway, he had no intention of harming the Church of the Night, and his poet classmate wouldn't necessarily conclude that he was Klein Moretti just because he was acquainted with Mobit. Mobit also raised his glass in response, smiling. Then we must have a good chat. Where is Mr. Don Tangte from? Dixie County, Klein replied with a smile. What a coincidence. I'm also from Dixie County, but I spend most of my time on the South Continent. Oh, I've done some business there and have some understanding of the South Continent. Really? Then we must have a good chat. The two talked happily, and before they knew it, they had moved away from the crowd. It wasn't until they reached an empty corner that Mobit asked with a look of surprise. Why are you here? I was going to ask you that. Klein retorted irritably, his gaze subtly observing the crowd, and replied. Member of Parliament Mocked and I are neighbors. Mobit took a sip of champagne, his gaze wandering over the people coming and going, and said. Member of Parliament Mocked's family attended Mass at St. Samuel Cathedral last weekend. I happened to be there at the time, and Leonard was also there. I noticed then that Miss Hazel was somewhat unusual, possessing a certain unique aura. Frankly, I was deeply attracted to her, so I asked Bishop Electra to bring me to the dinner party. Mobit spoke rather subtly, but Klein immediately understood his hidden meaning. Last weekend, Member of Parliament Mocked's family attended Mass at St. Samuel Cathedral, and Mobit and Leonard happened to be there at the time. It was highly likely that the old man within Leonard discovered the abnormality on Hazel. Not only was she a Beander of the Marauder pathway, but she likely also bore traces left by a high-sequence Beander. And coincidentally, Mobit needed to advance to Sequence 4 and was missing a Sequence 4 Beander characteristic. As Mobit's ancestor, the old man within Leonard would certainly not hesitate to provide assistance. Even though this angel was severely injured during Amon's hunt, he was not comparable to a demigod. Hunting a demigod of the Marauder pathway, while not easy, was at least within reach. And Hazel, who was exposed right under their noses, became the potential pathway to a Sequence 4 Beander characteristic. However, at that time, the old man should not have been able to determine exactly where that demigod was, which was why he had Leonard and Mobit attend the dinner party together for further confirmation. In other words, their goals were actually the same. Klein's eyelid twitched slightly. He took a sip of the pale golden champagne and said, "Then let's each rely on our own abilities." Mobit raised an eyebrow, sizing up Klein, and said in a slightly joking tone. I really didn't see it coming. At your age, you still have such thoughts. Klein glanced at him. He was asking why a Beander of the Seer pathway would want a Sequence 4 Beander characteristic of the Marauder pathway. Leaving aside the fact that these two pathways could be interchanged, he could seamlessly switch to the Marauder pathway without worrying about the risk of losing control. Moreover, this demigod was not his target. Klein shook his head and said, not me, him. Mobit raised an eyebrow slightly and turned his gaze to Ember. The other person was having a pleasant conversation with Miss Hazel. More specifically, Miss Hazel seemed to be very curious about Ember and kept asking him questions, while in contrast, Ember's attitude, while not cold or impatient, was simply answering her questions one by one, seemingly indifferent to Miss Hazel. He was interested in a demigod of the Marauder pathway. Could he also be of the Marauder pathway? Was there such a coincidence? And his abilities didn't seem to be related to the Marauder pathway, right? Even if there was a connection, Ember was at least a Sequence 2 or higher angel. After all, the only beings who could hunt a Sequence 3 demigod of the Church of the God of War in a short period of time were angels of Sequence 2 or higher. And if the other person was already an angel, why would he need a Sequence 4 Beander characteristic? After a few minutes of small talk, Klein and Mobit parted ways. Mobit walked towards Leonard, who was observing the crowd alone in a corner, and his poet classmate, seeing this, also proactively asked. You know each other? Sort of. Mobit did not give a direct detailed answer, but said. Don Tangte's friend also seems to be interested in Miss Hazel. Leonard looked thoughtfully at Ember. He knew that Ember was also a Nighthawk of the Church of the Night and had a mysterious identity. Although he was not a Red Gloves, his authority was even higher than that of the Red Gloves. It wasn't strange that he was interested in that Sequence 4 demigod. The question was he interested in apprehending this demigod, or was it for some purpose of his own? Leonard lowered his voice, as if muttering to himself. Old man, what do you think? Leonard waited for a long time, but the slightly aged voice in his mind never responded. Chapter 316, Just a tap is enough. Seeing that the old man didn't make a sound, Leonard's heart immediately tightened. He wasn't worried about the old man having an accident, after all, he was parasitic in his body. If something really happened, he, the host, should be the first to have an accident. He wasn't worried about the old man's situation, after all, this wasn't the first time the old man had pretended to disappear like this. What truly made Leonard nervous was the reason the old man was pretending to disappear. In the past, the reason the old man would pretend to disappear was often because, as a Nighthawk, he frequently needed to approach or even enter and exit Channy's Gate. And Channy's Gate itself was a manifestation of the Evernight goddess's authority. Even though the old man was a Sequence 1 angel, and even archbishops and senior deacons couldn't detect his parasitism, he didn't dare to be too presumptuous in front of the goddess. Now, the old man no longer responding to his call meant that the old man believed there was an existence in this banquet that was beyond his expectations. The old man must have thought that the other party could discover his existence, so he didn't dare to make a sound, fearing that a clue would be discovered. And the sequence of such an existence would definitely not be lower than the old man's. Could it be Aemon? A chilling guess suddenly popped into Leonard's mind. Blasphemer Aemon. The old man had once mentioned that he was hiding from a high-sequence Beander named Aemon. It was precisely because he was severely injured by the other party that he had no choice but to transfer and parasitize into his body. Could Aemon be among the guests at this banquet? Or rather, was Aemon parasitic inside one of them? No, it shouldn't be. Leonard took a deep breath, calming himself down. If it were truly Aemon, then this angel named Aemon must have some method to sense or detect the old man's existence, otherwise the old man wouldn't have to keep hiding from him. And if that were the case, then the old man wouldn't need to conceal himself, a desperate fight would be a better option. What's more, the old man was afraid of the goddess and wary of the Church of the Night. Since the angel named Aemon had not yet become a god, it was impossible for him to be completely unafraid of the goddess. This was the North District, not far from St. Samuel Cathedral. Even if the other party discovered the old man, they would likely not dare to act here. Otherwise, it would only be a struggle between the snipe and the clam, with the fisherman benefiting. In other words, the existence at this banquet should not be Aemon. But the fact that the old man was wary of them indicated that the other party was at least an angel of the ground. And since the old man chose to hide himself, it meant that he had a certain degree of confidence that the other party wouldn't discover him. Thinking this, Leonard's peripheral vision suddenly caught Mobit walking towards him. Mobit took a glass of champagne from a waiter and suddenly asked, "How is it?" Leonard's expression remained unchanged, and he asked in return, "How is what?" Mobit raised an eyebrow, but quickly realized the reason. The old man hadn't replied to him. Why wouldn't even the parasitic target reply? Either his state was too poor to reply, or there was an external factor influencing him. And for the old man, an angel, to be influenced, the existence would have to be at least an angel. Coincidentally, Mobit happened to know an angel. Eliminating all impossibilities, the remaining answer, no matter how absurd, is the only truth. This is troublesome now. Mobit felt a little helpless in his heart. He only knew that Ember was an angel, but he didn't expect that even the old man was afraid of him. Didn't this mean that Ember wasn't the Sequence 2 he thought, but at least a Sequence 1 angel? Moreover, unlike the old man, who was a half-crippled angel, Ember was clearly in his prime, so it was no wonder the old man was so afraid he didn't dare to show his face. Mobit subtly reminded, "Don't worry, I also know that Mr. Black. We are friends." Leonard immediately understood Mobit's hint. Mobit knew that Ash was an angel, and the person the old man was afraid of might be Ash Black. A vicissitude's voice echoed in Leonard's mind. He has an ancient aura about him. A Beander who has lived for a long time. Leonard muttered softly. The old man suddenly replying to him now meant that Mobit's guess was correct. The old man was indeed afraid of Ash Black. The slightly aged voice said in a low tone, "Ancient and deadly. I have a premonition that even in my prime, I would not be his match." Leonard's hand paused slightly as he raised it, but he quickly regained his composure and brought the champagne to his lips to take a sip. The old man's evaluation was very high, but Leonard didn't feel much about it. Because whether it was a Sequence 2 angel or a Sequence 1 angel, there wasn't much difference to him. Anyway, they were existences that could crush him into dust with a wave of their hand. His current focus was on what Mobit had just said. "I also know that Mr. Black." "What do you mean, you also know him?" Leonard narrowed his eyes. He knew Ember, or more accurately, he had met him twice. The first time was in Tingen. At that time, Al Hansen led a team of Nighthawks to escort sealed artifact 2049 to Tingen to assist them in pursuing Riel Bieber, and Ash Black was among them. That time, the other party only stayed for 1 day, and the next day, they returned to Backland with sealed artifact, 2049, and the Antigonus family notebook. The second meeting was not long ago, when they brushed past each other in the underground area of the church. The other party seemed to be in a hurry to enter Channy's gate, while he had just left there. And at that time, he seemed to have asked the old man's opinion, and the old man's reaction at that time. Leonard's expression first showed some confusion, then turned somewhat fearful, his pupils constricting sharply, and he questioned in a low voice. "You moved my memory," Pale's Zoroaster said ill-temperedly. "I did that for your own good. If I had truly intended to steal your memory, do you think you would have been able to discover it?" Leonard remained silent, because he knew the old man was telling the truth. If an angel truly intended to do something, it would be impossible for him to discover any clues, let alone allow him to recall Thistystalin, memory. And the reason the old man did this was out of fear of Ash Black. The old man's reaction last time was the best proof. But Leonard didn't understand why the old man was so afraid. And why did he have to erase his memory? Was it possible that even obtaining information related to the other party was dangerous? But if that were the case, then why did the old man return this memory? Could it be because they met again, causing this precautionary measure to lose its meaning? Leonard was silent for a long time, then asked, "What do we do now?" Pales was silent for a long time, then sighed faintly. "Enjoy the banquet." Leonard remained silent, only subtly shaking his head at Mobit beside him. The old man saying this was equivalent to giving up on investigating the demigod behind Hazel. They couldn't compete with Dwayne Dantes' friend. Mobit shrugged, he himself didn't feel much about it. If there's no opportunity, then there's no opportunity. You can't force these things. If all else fails, he'll just have to find a way to collect Beander materials himself. It might be a little slower, but so be it. A few minutes later, Member of Parliament Mocked excused himself and, with his wife Liana, walked towards the staircase, ascending to the second floor. At the railing directly opposite the entrance, he raised his glass of red wine and said, "Thank you all for attending this ball. First, let us praise the divine, the source of all good things." He and Liana then tapped their chests 4 times, softly praising the goddess. The guests also praised the deities they believed in their respective ways. Most of the people here were followers of the Evernight goddess, and even Mobit pretended to tap his chest a few times. Member of Parliament Mocked still held his glass, not putting it down, and continued with a smile. Secondly, praise the kingdom, the foundation of stability. Praise the kingdom. Klein raised his glass of champagne and followed the guests around him in saying. Then, Member of Parliament Mocked looked around and asked humorously. Finally, what should we praise? Klein's mind stirred, and he laughed loudly. Praise the improvement of Backland's air. Member of Parliament Mocked was taken aback for a moment, then responded with an irrepressible smile. Excellent, that's an excellent suggestion. Let us praise the improvement of Backland's air, a symbol of our better lives. Cheers. Governing air pollution had always been his political ideal as a member of parliament. He had consistently promoted the formulation of relevant bills on various occasions and had played a significant role in environmental improvement. Therefore, praising the improvement of Backland's air was equivalent to praising him, and it was more subtle and more open and above board. The guests responded enthusiastically, drinking the alcoholic beverages in their hands. Immediately after, Member of Parliament Mocked took Liana's hand and descended to the first-floor hall, where they began the opening dance to a gentle melody. Klein walked over to Ember and asked with a hint of teasing. "Aren't you going to ask her for a dance?" Ember followed Klein's gaze and saw Hazel standing at the edge of the hall, and said, "It's not on her." Klein raised his eyebrows slightly. This wasn't surprising. Hazel's family was, after all, a member of Parliament's family, and a bishop visited regularly. And the Church of the Night must have methods to detect and restrain parasites. If that demigod were parasitic in Hazel, they would likely be discovered by the Church of the Night. After all, not every parasite is an angel, capable of being like the old man inside the poet-student, with enough confidence not to be exposed. Klein took a sip of champagne and said, "Even if it's not on her, dancing shouldn't be too much, right?" At the edge of the hall, Hazel Mocked held a glass of white wine, wearing a slightly distant smile, watching the gentlemen each selecting their partners and preparing to invite them to dance, but she was an exception. No one took the initiative to invite her. This wasn't because Hazel wasn't beautiful. Frankly speaking, this young lady was quite good-looking, with a graceful and gentle appearance. She should have been the star of the ball, the object of everyone's eager invitation to dance, but her arrogant attitude, carrying a sense of condescension, caused the gentlemen who had looked her way to shift their targets one by one. This arrogance didn't stem from her father's identity as a member of parliament. After all, there were also nobles and other members of parliament at this banquet, whose status wasn't necessarily inferior to member of parliament mocked. What truly made Hazel feel inherently superior was her own strength, her identity as a Beyonder. Klein had seen many similar Beyonders. They considered themselves no longer ordinary, and when facing ordinary people, they would have a strong sense of superiority. This wasn't strange. Strength always makes people arrogant. The more ignorant a person is, the more they will feel different, and the more arrogant they will be. But the problem was, this was Backland. Miss Justice was also from Backland, and a noble young lady of higher status than Hazel. And even Miss Justice knew that being a Beyonder wasn't that easy. She had sufficient channels to become an official Beyonder, but she didn't choose this path, instead choosing to exchange for the potion formula of the Spectator pathway from the Tarot Club. And up until now, Miss Justice had disguised herself very well, almost never being discovered as a Beyonder by anyone. Similarly, Miss Magician and Miss Judgment were also in Backland, and they were both wild Beyonders. Although Klein hadn't met them in reality, he could tell from their usual words and actions that they were extremely cautious in their daily lives, fearing being discovered by official Beyonders. This was also the way most wild Beyonders survived. Even Sharon, a Sequence 5 Beyonder just one step away from demigod, was extremely low-key in her daily life. The more arrogant Hazel acted, the more ignorant she appeared. Ignorance is fearless. But since the one who guided her onto the path of a Beyonder was a demigod, how could they teach such an ignorant student? Didn't that demigod tell Miss Hazel the common sense of how a Beyonder should survive? Moreover, as a Beyonder of the Marauder pathway, one could guess how to act from the name of the potion, so how could Hazel's arrogant demeanor act as a marauder and a swindler? It was truly hard to imagine what kind of person could teach such a student. There were only two possibilities. One was that the demigod didn't understand the acting method, and their own attitude was also extremely arrogant, and it was this arrogance that influenced Hazel. But this possibility was very small. After all, a Beyonder who always maintained arrogance and didn't understand the acting method would be difficult to live and become a demigod, and would likely die from losing control during advancement because they couldn't complete the acting. And the second possibility was that the demigod never intended to properly cultivate Hazel as a student. The reason they led her onto the path of a Beyonder was likely to use her as a host for parasitism. Although the presence of the Church of the Night prevented the other party from easily parasitizing Hazel. But when Hazel's sequence was higher, the other party might directly parasitize Hazel and escape. Klein couldn't help but shake his head, feeling a hint of pity for this Miss Hazel in his heart. She was also a pitiful person. Fortunately, the old man inside the poet student wasn't this kind of person, otherwise he wouldn't have allowed the poet student to become a sleepless. Ember also took a sip of champagne and slowly said, "There's no need for that. Barring any accidents, this should be our last contact tonight." Although Klein didn't know how Ember confirmed this, he understood his underlying meaning, because they would be able to find that demigod tonight, there was no need to continue contacting Hazel. But, was that really the case? Chapter 317, Lord Hibbert. Although Ember's reason was sufficient, Klein was skeptical about it. After all, he didn't think Ember was someone who cared about such trivial matters. What could dancing change? Could it be that dancing could quickly bring you two closer, making Hazel fall hopelessly in love with you? This was clearly impossible. After all, Ember wasn't a succubus. He must have other reasons for doing this. The only question was, what was the reason? Klein held his champagne and looked around, his gaze occasionally sweeping over the guests, but he never found the key clue he expected. Of course, it was also possible that there was no reason at all, and Ember simply didn't want to invite Hazel to dance. But Klein wasn't Ember. He needed to maintain the identity of Don Tangte, so he couldn't act too aloof. At similar evening parties like this, guests should at least invite a lady for one dance. Because the purpose of the banquet itself was for socializing, and the dance at the beginning of the evening party was a social dance, essentially serving the purpose of socializing. Female guests could refuse invitations from other male guests on the grounds of feeling unwell. But if a male guest couldn't find a lady willing to dance one dance with him, he would be considered friendless, unpopular, and the best result would be considered not good at socializing. So, to be safe, it was a good choice for male guests to bring a female companion when attending an evening party. If there was no female companion, one should invite someone they were familiar with. And unfortunately, at this evening party, Klein didn't have many acquaintances. The only three ladies Don Tangte knew were Liana, one of the hosts of the evening party, Vahana, his etiquette teacher, and Miss Hazel, the daughter of Member of Parliament mocked. The latter didn't need to be considered, and Vahana also wouldn't work. She should already know about the previous secret help. Inviting her to the first dance at this time could easily lead to misunderstandings, possibly affecting her relationship with her husband and causing many unnecessary troubles for the identity of Danton's. I'm not an emperor who has a penchant for married women, no, he has a penchant for everything, anyway, I should avoid suspicion. Klein shifted his gaze to the center of the hall, looking at the member of parliament and his wife who had finished the opening dance. Liana, may I have this dance? Don Tangte, with graying temples, walked up and bowed correctly. Of course. Liana smiled and extended her hand. She knew that Don Tangte had just arrived in Backland and didn't know many people. This was even his first social evening party, making it difficult for him to find a lady willing to dance the first dance with him for a while. And as the host of the banquet, Liana certainly wouldn't embarrass a guest, so she was happy to help him out of the situation. Member of Parliament Mocht watched the two enter the dance floor with a smile, dancing a light and lively dance to the melody. He took a glass of champagne from a waiter and glanced at Hazel standing on the edge from the corner of his eye. A vacuum zone had almost formed around her, no gentleman attempted to approach her. Seeing this situation, Member of Parliament Mocht couldn't help but sigh, feeling a bit helpless inside. Their family had held many evening parties, and most guests were not first-timers. Most of these people had tried to invite Hazel at previous evening parties, but she had refused them all on the grounds of feeling unwell. The result was like this now. Guests who had already been rejected wouldn't invite Hazel again to make fools of themselves. And guests who were attending the evening party for the first time would basically not actively invite Hazel. Plus, since Hazel had not been invited by anyone, new guests could mostly guess what was going on and knew that there was a high possibility of being rejected if they invited her, so they naturally wouldn't make fools of themselves. After all, in such social settings, being rejected often leads to very serious consequences. Thinking this, he turned his gaze to Ember on the other side of the hall. Viscount Black was also alone, standing on the edge of the hall watching others dance in the ballroom, but he had no intention of participating, which made Member of Parliament Mocht a little confused. Although he, like Don Tangte, was attending their family's social evening party for the first time. But he had just had a pleasant conversation with Hazel, even to the point where Mocht was worried that Hazel would get too close to him. But now, the other party didn't have any intention of inviting Hazel. Was he also scared and didn't dare to invite her? Member of Parliament Mocht thought for a moment and prepared to walk around the edge of the dance floor to Ember's side. A qualified host would not let any guest be impolite. He was going to help Viscount Black out of the situation and personally lead him to invite Hazel for the first dance. As for whether this would quickly warm up their relationship, Member of Parliament Mocht didn't think so, as he knew his daughter's personality well. But before Member of Parliament Mocht could speak, his gaze suddenly caught sight of a handsome man with brilliant golden hair holding a glass of red wine, walking towards Viscount Black with a smile. Member of Parliament Mocht stopped and lowered his eyebrows slightly. He knew that golden-haired man. Without a doubt, he was likely the guest with the highest status present. Because he was the eldest son of Earl of Eastchester, Hibbert Hall, a future earl. He and Viscount Black knew each other. Earl Hall's fief was in Eastchester County, also in the north, adjacent to Winter County. And from the current situation, they clearly knew each other before. Could it be that their families' fiefs were very close, so their relationship was also relatively close? Member of Parliament Mocht wasn't sure about their relationship, so he didn't step forward immediately, but observed silently from the side. Hibbert Hall smiled and greeted him. Ash, long time no see. You haven't visited my home for quite some time recently. Ember raised his glass and lightly touched his, also smiling. To be precise, 4 months. Hibbert took a sip of red wine and teased. My mother has been talking about you recently, and Audrey also really wants to see you. If you have time recently, come over for dinner. Ember put down his glass, thought for a moment, and said. I have time tomorrow and the day after. Receiving a positive reply, Hibbert showed a satisfied smile and then asked curiously. Do you know Member of Parliament Mocht? No. Ember shook his head and explained. I met Don Tangte a few times when I was in South Wales. I asked him to bring me to this evening party. What about you? Hibbert immediately realized the hidden meaning in his words. Having known him for so long, Hibbert knew that Ember wasn't someone who liked socializing. If Ember had such intentions, he could have completely attended the balls hosted by the upper Lowen nobility. So he wouldn't inexplicably ask a businessman he had only met a few times to bring him to an evening party hosted by a member of parliament. Considering Ember's identity, Hibbert could roughly guess the reason. Among the guests at this evening party, there was likely a very dangerous Beander hidden. But Ember didn't know these guests and wasn't sure which guests would attend this evening party. The only ones he was sure would attend were the hosts of the evening party, Member of Parliament Mocht's family. In other words, there was a Beander hidden in Member of Parliament Mocht's home. If it was just an ordinary Beander, Ember shouldn't need to personally intervene, as it wasn't uncommon for the upper class to keep Beanders. As long as nothing happened, the church and the royal family generally wouldn't interfere. Unless this Beander in Member of Parliament Mocht's home was of a very high sequence and had a high probability of causing unimaginable destruction. Hibbert quickly sorted out the whole story and said with a smile. I'm different from you. As you know, I am the Chief Secretary of the Atmospheric Pollution Investigation Committee. And Member of Parliament Mocht has always strongly supported this area, and many atmospheric pollution-related bills have been introduced with his help. A few minutes later, a lady finished her first dance and walked to their side, smiling. Hibbert, what are you two talking about? Hibbert immediately introduced the two. Ash, this is Mary Short, the largest shareholder of Callum Company and also a member of the Atmospheric Pollution Investigation Committee. Mary, this is Viscount Ash Black from Winter County. His family history is even older than the Hall family. After a pause, Hibbert smiled and said, speaking of which, Ash should also be a shareholder of Callum Company. Last year, I suggested that Ash invest in Callum Company. I originally planned to do it myself, but because I was busy promoting bills at the time, I could only hand it over to the people below. Ash, how much did you invest back then? Ember took a sip of champagne, thought for a moment, and said. About £10,000, it's been too long, I don't remember clearly either. Hibbert had indeed mentioned this to him at the time, so he just casually invested a little, well, some of it was borrowed from Audrey. Mary Short looked surprised and said softly. Yes, £10,000. When Viscount Black invested, he already owned 10% of the company's shares. As the largest shareholder of Callum Company, Mary Short owned 20% of the company's shares. But at that time, she was still busy with her divorce and didn't put most of her attention on handling company affairs, so even when there were changes in the company's equity, she didn't understand the details at the time. And after the fact, when she learned that 10% of the company's equity belonged to a Mr. Ash Black, she had actually thought about visiting this Mr. Ice Shoe, but unfortunately, although he owned 10% of Callum Company's shares, he had never come to the company himself. If it wasn't for the fact that the 10% equity truly belonged to the other party, Mary would have doubted whether such a person even existed. And she never expected that she would meet this shareholder under such circumstances. Hibbert joked. Then it seems my judgment was quite accurate. This investment was very worthwhile. Mary Sean's expression was a bit complex. Callum Company was originally just a small company that could barely make some money, but as the pollution in Backland worsened and the demand for anthracite and charcoal increased, Callum Company rapidly expanded and grew, gradually becoming one of the top 10 companies in the industry in the capital region. By the time Viscount Black invested last year, the total value of Callum Company was already £100,000. And in the past few months, with the successive introduction of atmospheric pollution-related bills, the demand for anthracite and high-quality charcoal has greatly increased, and Callum Company has achieved development exceeding many years of past efforts. Its total value is reportedly over £250,000. In other words, the £10,000 Ember invested last year is now worth at least £25,000. A 150% return rate, far exceeding most investments on the market. How is this just worthwhile? But this wasn't because Hibbert had accurate judgment, but because he himself was actually part of the relevant interest group. As the Chief Secretary of the Atmospheric Pollution Investigation Committee, Hibbert also played a role in promoting the introduction of those relevant bills. And as the instigator of all this, how could Hibbert not discover business opportunities? Although he himself, due to his status, needed to avoid suspicion and did not invest in Callum Company. After all, Callum Company sounded like a behemoth with a total value exceeding £250,000, but the Hall family was even larger, with its wealth calculated in tens of millions of pounds. Although the total value of Callum Company is expected to continue to rise in the foreseeable future, even possibly breaking the £100,000 mark, it is still less than 1% of the Hall family's wealth. And compared to the small amount of money from Callum Company, Hibbert's political future was clearly more important. So Mary never knew that her company's shareholder was actually Hibbert's friend, and that the other party had even invested in Callum Company on Hibbert's recommendation. Moreover, it can be seen from Viscount Black's conversation that he didn't care about this £10,000 at all, just treating it as a casual move, and it didn't matter even if the investment lost money. Therefore, as a shareholder of Callum Company, he never inquired about the company's operational status. Mary Sean's expression became increasingly complex. Although she held 20% of Cowham Company's shares, with total assets exceeding £50,000, even for her, £10,000 in cash was not something she could casually produce. It accounted for 1/5 of her total wealth. And it should be known that most nobles, those viscounts and barons, their assets were not necessarily more than Mary Sean's, and many of them were even burdened with huge debts and on the verge of bankruptcy. So it's no wonder that Viscount Black could have such a pleasant conversation with Hibbert. Their family strengths were perhaps extremely similar. Hibbert even personally admitted that Viscount Black's family history was older than the Hall family, very likely an ancient noble family that existed since the founding of the kingdom. For this part of the nobility, the rank of their title was meaningless, because their actual status was often several levels higher than their title. Hibbert looked at Mrs. Mary's expression and could roughly guess what she was thinking. But he didn't pay attention to it and instead thought about who in the hall was the most likely source of danger. He didn't ask Ember if he needed help, because he spotted Bishop Electra and the man in a black trenchcoat beside him. Hibbert was not unfamiliar with this attire. The Nighthawks who protected them were dressed the same way. Compared to the Church of the Night, which had a large number of Beyonders, his magician, who was only sequence 7, was nothing. One more of him wouldn't make a difference, and one less wouldn't matter. Since he didn't need his help, Hibbert had to consider how not to interfere with the Church of the Night's actions. After all, among the many people present, his status was undoubtedly the most noble. Once that potential dangerous Beyonder erupted, they would definitely take him hostage. However, since Ember didn't remind him to leave early, it meant that although the danger level of this matter was high, it should not be urgent. There was no need to worry too much. Chapter 318, Information Exchange. The so-called banquet could be summarized as dancing, eating, chatting, and eating. In this harmonious atmosphere, guests began to leave one after another. Mobit and Leonard boarded the four-wheeled carriage he had recently purchased, and under the dim light cast by rows of gas lamps, they drove into the darkness towards Pesfield Street. Mobit looked at Leonard, who was sitting opposite him seemingly lost in thought, and asked curiously, "What are you thinking about?" Leonard Mitchell slowly raised his head and suddenly said, "Where did you meet Don Tangte?" Mobit raised an eyebrow and replied with a smile, "Dixie County, what's wrong?" Leonard Mitchell stared intently into Mobit's eyes and said word by word, "You can use this line to fool others, but you can't fool me." Mobit responded with a smile, neither confirming nor denying, while Leonard Mitchell continued, "You once said that you were trapped in a book for over 1,000 years and only recently got out. Even Old Man found it strange that you could live for 1,000 years, because you aren't even a demigod. Theoretically, you should have aged and died the moment you left that book. And according to you, someone saved you and also asked you to believe in a certain existence. And the person you said saved you is Ash Black." Mobit was about to speak, but Leonard interrupted him and continued, "He is an angel, even stronger than Old Man. It's not strange that he has this ability. And this is how you met, which is why you seem so familiar with each other, and why you told Old Man not to worry. And Old Man also noticed your relationship, realized that he saved you, and simply stopped hiding." Pausing for a moment, Leonard continued, "It's also possible that Old Man felt there was no point in hiding, as he should have been discovered long ago. So he simply gave up. After all, you were able to accurately find St. Samuel Cathedral back then, which means someone must have provided accurate information, and that person is Ash Black." Mobit raised an eyebrow and said seriously, "I think the second possibility is greater." Ha ha. The old voice in Leonard's mind let out a cold laugh, but whether it was due to guilt or something else, he didn't argue. Mobit chuckled softly and said, "But I need to correct something. It was indeed Ember who saved us, but the person who told me about Old Man wasn't him." Leonard looked deeply at Mobit. His words revealed two layers of meaning. He called Ash, Ember. Although Ash Black is the name registered by the other party in the Church of the Night, perhaps, Ember, is the other party's real name. Of course, it's also possible that both are fake names. After all, he is an angel, and it's unlikely he would reveal his real name. Moreover, a name is just a code, there's no need to dwell on it too much. The other layer of meaning is that the other party implicitly admitted that more than one person saved them from the book world. Leonard quickly pressed, "Is that person Don Tangte?" Mobit smiled, neither admitting nor denying. Leonard said calmly, "It's fine if you don't say. You stayed in the book world for over 1,000 years, and when you came out, you were in the Sonia Sea. After that, you took a steamship directly to Pritz Harbor, then a steam train to Backland. You've never been to Dixie County, so it's impossible for you to have met Don Tangte in Dixie County. So both of your identities are fake. If you didn't meet him in Dixie County, then it could only have been in the Sonia Sea." You know Don Tangte, and you know Ember, and he also knows Ember. This further indicates that when Ember saved you from the book world, Don Tangte was also there. You should have arrived at Pritz Harbor at the same time, but you chose to return to Backland, while he took a steam train to Dixie County. So there's a difference of a few days in your arrival times in Backland. During this time, he should have been in Dixie County preparing the identity of Don Tangte. Leonard spoke faster and faster, his tone becoming more and more certain, almost convinced that this was the complete picture of events. Mobit shrugged and said, "So what are you planning to do? Report us to the Church of the Night." Leonard glanced at him and said coldly, "You know that's impossible." Leaving aside the fact that if Mobit is exposed, the old man inside him will also be exposed, making it difficult for him to continue his position in the Church of the Night. Furthermore, Mobit was saved by Ember, and Ember also knows about Don Tangte's fake identity. On top of that, Ember is an angel with intricate ties to the Church of the Night. In other words, Mobit's and Don Tangte's fake identities are, to some extent, vouched for by Ember, the angel. If he were to personally report to Archbishop St. Anthony, the Archbishop would most likely not solve the problem, but rather solve him, the person who raised the problem. Leonard knew this clearly in his heart, so even if he were to self-destruct, he wouldn't try to report these two people. Mobit rubbed his chin and asked, somewhat puzzled, "Since you understand everything, why are you asking for so much detail?" Leonard fell silent, and Mobit didn't disturb him, just watching him quietly. After a long while, Leonard spoke in a complex tone. "Before August last year, I was stationed in Tingen. Tingen is a very small place. The strongest official Beander was only Sequence 7, and I was only Sequence 8 at that time. But the danger there was also small, most of the time we could easily handle it. But in August, we were forced into a conspiracy. The planner of the conspiracy was a renegade archbishop of the Church of the Night. He stole a sealed artifact classified as 0 from the church and used it to orchestrate a crisis of an evil god descending. During that crisis, most Beyonders were transferred out in advance, leaving only 3 people at headquarters, and I was one of them. Although we eventually succeeded in preventing the evil god from descending, they all sacrificed themselves, and only I miraculously survived." Leonard couldn't help but clench his fists. Even now, he was still bothered by that incident. Why wasn't it him who died? Mobit, who was hearing this story for the first time, also fell silent. He could understand Leonard's feelings and asked hesitantly, "What does this have to do with you pressing about Don Tangte's identity?" Leonard took a deep breath, composed himself, and said in a deep voice, "Ember once came to Tingen and had a good relationship with one of the teammates who died. I suspect they already knew each other at that time." Mobit felt a bit absurd and couldn't help but ask, "You suspect Don Tangte is your dead teammate?" "Yes." Leonard didn't hide his guess. "How is that possible? Ember saved us, but the premise was that we were still alive at that time. This is a different concept from resurrection. And your teammate, didn't you already confirm his death?" Leonard said calmly, "I buried him myself." "Then why are you still asking?" Mobit was somewhat incredulous. Could it be that he had been parasitized by Old Man for too long, and his brain was damaged? Leonard said in a deep voice, "When I was still Sequence 8, I knew a Sequence 6 Nighthawk who was a Beander of the Corpse Collector pathway. And even though she was only Sequence 6 at the time, she already had the ability to manipulate the undead and natural spirits. So at that time, I naively thought that perhaps the demigod level had the ability to bring people back from the dead. But Old Man told me that there is indeed an ability in this world that can bring people back from the dead, but demigods definitely cannot do it. But Old Man didn't say that only gods can do it, which means angels also have this ability, right? And both your and Old Man's reactions tell me that Ember is an angel. So that's why he suspected Don Tangte was his resurrected teammate." Mobit pondered for 2 seconds and slowly asked, "Do you have any evidence?" "Yes." Leonard nodded without hesitation. Mobit's expression was strange, and he joked, "You didn't dig up your teammate's grave, did you?" Mobit expected Leonard to reply with a cold face, "Am I that kind of person?" But instead, Leonard showed a thoughtful expression. He seemed to be seriously considering the possibility of this matter. Mobit's eye twitched. To be honest, this was beyond his imagination. Leonard pondered for a moment and said, "Shortly after my teammate was buried, a detective named Sherlock Moriarty appeared in Backland. The timing completely matches. And most importantly, they looked almost identical. Unfortunately, by the time I wanted to start investigating, this detective had already gone missing in an accident." Mobit pondered for 2 seconds and asked, "When?" 2 days before the new year." Upon getting the answer, Mobit slightly lowered his eyes. He had investigated the crazy adventurer a little while he was at sea. Although most pirates held reverence for this famous bounty hunter and knew little about him, the only thing certain was that the first time this crazy adventurer appeared in the Sonia Sea was in January this year. Gehrman Sparrow first appeared in Pritz Harbor, and at that time, he was taking the White Agate to the Rorstad archipelago. This information was told to him personally by Captain Aylant of the White Agate. Mobit's eyes flickered slightly. The timing is indeed very coincidental. Right after Leonard's teammate died, a detective named Sherlock Moriarty appeared in Backland. And right after this Sherlock detective had an accident, a Gehrman Sparrow, feared by pirates, appeared at sea. And right after Gehrman Sparrow disappeared from the sea, a Don Tangte appeared in Backland. Mobit didn't know if the first two could be equated, but he knew that Gehrman Sparrow was Don Tangte. It's no wonder Leonard would suspect that Don Tangte was his dead teammate. If it were Mobit, he would probably suspect it too. Mobit suddenly asked, "What did your teammate look like?" Leonard thought for a moment, took out a photo from his pocket, and handed it over. Mobit took the photo and looked at it. On the black and white photo was a young man with a strong scholarly air. Leonard suddenly asked, "Have you seen him?" "No." Mobit shook his head, his attitude extremely frank. Because he really hadn't seen him. In fact, he didn't even know what Gehrman Sparrow looked like. After all, he was a faceless who could change his appearance freely. For such a Beander, as long as he didn't want to, no one would know his true face. This was true for Mobit, and also for Iceberg Admiral. Ember might be an exception, but they couldn't just go and ask Ember, right? Mobit continued to ask, "What was his name?" Leonard was silent for a long time and then said, "Klein." Mobit asked without changing his expression, "Which pathway was your friend a Beander of?" Leonard observed Mobit's expression and slowly said, "The Seer pathway. When he died, he was already a Sequence 8 clown." Mobit showed a thoughtful expression, but his heart was inexplicably surprised. Unlike Beyonders of the 5th epoch, Mobit, who was born in the 4th epoch and came from an angel family, knew far more common sense than current Beyonders. For example, although he didn't know the potion formulas for other pathways, he clearly knew the names of the low and mid-sequence potions in each pathway. This was also what Old Man required. He didn't need Beyonders of other pathways in the family, but he had to know what abilities Beyonders of other pathways had, so that there would be ways to counter them. Most angel families basically had similar rules, and they all had sufficient ability to understand what abilities other pathways possessed. And Faceless happens to be Sequence 6 of the Seer pathway. Isn't this getting more and more coincidental? Mobit's expression remained calm, not revealing any flaws. And Leonard stared at him for a long time without finding anything, and finally had to give up in frustration. After all, if the other party was determined not to say, he couldn't force him. Just then, the old voice in his mind suddenly said, "Resurrection is the ability of Miracle Invoker, Sequence 2 of the Seer pathway." Leonard's pupils constricted sharply. Was this indirectly telling him that Ember was an angel of the Seer pathway? Because he was an angel of the Seer pathway, he had a great liking for Klein, who was also of the Seer pathway, and that's why he brought Klein back to life. Mobit noticed Leonard's abnormality and asked, "What did he tell you?" Leonard didn't hide it and repeated Old Man's words. Mobit fell into thought for a moment but still said, "Ember shouldn't be an angel of the Seer pathway." Leonard's expression shifted slightly, but he didn't reveal too many flaws. Instead, he slowly said, "I don't think I told you about my other teammate." Mobit asked in confusion, "Didn't he also sacrifice himself?" "Yes." Leonard nodded and said, "That was my captain. To fight the evil god, he forcibly used Saint Selena's ashes and ultimately sacrificed himself because of it. But before he sacrificed himself, Klein gave him a ring. When the captain sacrificed himself, that ring also shattered. And unexpectedly, the captain came back to life." Mobit's pupils constricted sharply. A ring that could bring people back from the dead. Is it because there was already a precedent of resurrection that Leonard was so certain? Chapter 319, Civil Engineering, Not Even Dogs Would Do It. Late at night, at Member of Parliament Mock's home, while everyone was fast asleep, Hazel quietly got out of bed, used her night vision to change into clothes suitable for movement. She climbed down from her bedroom balcony, carefully avoided the family's bodyguards, sneaked out of the garden, and arrived at the middle section of Beaucrenland Street. Not all sewer entrances allowed humans free passage and had vertical metal ladders. Arriving next to the sewer entrance, Hazel cautiously looked around for a few seconds before moving the manhole cover and climbing down. The entire process was seamless, without any hesitation. It was clear this wasn't her first time doing this, her skilled movements were somewhat heartbreaking. Stepping onto the slightly slippery ground, she moved forward quickly with clear purpose, following rusty iron pipes and a slowly flowing river of sewage. The sewers were interconnected in all directions, and unfamiliar people could easily get lost. But Hazel navigated through several corners with ease, arriving at the end of a fork, where there was a wall covered in dark moss and obvious corrosion. Hazel didn't hesitate, pressing her hands against the wall and fumbling for a bit. With a sound, she opened a secret door hidden in the wall. Using her excellent night vision, even in the darkness of the sewers, Hazel could see everything around her clearly. Passing through the secret door, the space before Hazel suddenly opened up. It was a half-natural, half-artificial cave, less than 1.8 meters high and about 3 meters wide. On the ground were items like shovels wrapped in tarps, piles of dirt and rubble, and 2 hidden passages extending diagonally downwards in front. The one on the left was only 5 or 6 meters deep, the one on the right nearly 10 meters, but neither contained anything yet, as they were still being excavated. Hazel skillfully picked up a shovel from the ground, peeled back the layers of covering tarp, and walked directly towards the hidden passage on the right. This proud miss from high society had now turned into a civil engineer, shoveling dirt tirelessly and without complaint in the dirty, smelly sewers. A voice suddenly sounded next to the young woman's ear. "Need any help?" Hazel was startled by the sudden voice, and when she whirled around, she found a man standing behind her. Most importantly, she knew this person. She had seen him at the dinner party held at her home. The fright in Hazel's eyes faded, replaced by gnashing anger. "You followed me." She was angry that he would actually follow her, and annoyed that she, as a Beander, hadn't detected him. But after the anger, Hazel suddenly realized a more serious problem. Why couldn't she, as a Beander, detect the other party? Hazel was confident that ordinary people couldn't evade her detection, which left only one possibility: this person was a Beander more powerful than her. Hazel took 2 steps back, feeling startled and uncertain. "Are you an official Beander?" At the dinner party, Ember and Bishop Electra had a very pleasant conversation. She had originally thought this was just due to the other party's noble status. But now, it clearly involved deeper factors. "You could say that." Ember nodded slightly, his gaze passing over the young woman to the passage that hadn't been fully excavated yet, and asked, "How did you find this place?" Hazel glanced back at the passage with some hesitation, not answering immediately. She was assessing the gap in strength between herself and Ember, and also weighing the gains and losses. While the other party was indeed an official Beander of the Church of the Night, her teacher was a legendary demigod. Ember looked at the seemingly hesitant young woman and slowly said, "Your parents are both believers of the Church of the Night." Hazel suddenly raised her head, her eyes filled with disbelief, seemingly unable to believe that the other party would use such a despicable method to threaten her. Ember looked at the young woman's clear, foolish eyes and said calmly, "Don't misunderstand, what I mean is, if your family weren't believers of the Church of the Night, I wouldn't be saying this much to you at all." The young woman pursed her lips lightly, her heart filled with conflict, unsure of what to do. After a long silence, Hazel still said hesitantly, I dreamed about it. Teacher, she told me how to become a Beander in my dream, and told me to find a way to come here and dig for something. At first, I didn't believe it, but I dreamed the same thing for several days in a row, and the potion formula she told me in the dream really made me a marauder, so. Hazel trailed off, but Ember could guess the whole story. Hazel's situation was similar to Audrey's back then, also a miss who longed for the mysterious world. The difference was that Audrey became a Beander through the Tarot Club, and thus had a strong sense of belonging to the Tarot Club, even a strong sense of ownership. So every time the Tarot Club started, Justice would be the first to greet everyone, and it was often she who introduced the other members to newcomers. Hazel, however, wasn't so lucky. She was guided by a demigod with ulterior motives through dreams, who helped her become a Beander. But Hazel didn't know this, so just like Audrey's strong sense of belonging to the Tarot Club, Hazel placed great trust in that demigod. That's why this proud miss didn't hesitate to crawl into the dirty, smelly sewers, doing work that even the poor in the East Borough wouldn't do, engaging in civil engineering in the sewers in the middle of the night. Seeing Ember remain silent for a long time, Hazel couldn't help but ask, "What are you going to do with me?" The young woman glanced at the space to Ember's right out of the corner of her eye, her gaze flickering as she clutched the necklace around her neck. Hearing this, Ember moved aside and said, "You can leave." Hazel was instead stunned for a moment, and said hesitantly, "Just like that?" Ember watched her calmly and slowly said, "Tomorrow morning, you will go to the Church of the Night to attend Mass with your parents. By then, I hope you can voluntarily confess everything that happened here to Bishop Electra. For your parents' sake, Bishop Electra won't lock you up in Channy's Gate, but your personal freedom will definitely be somewhat restricted. He should accept you as a Nighthawk and inform you about the acting method. This is the best choice, both for you and for your parents. Hazel looked startled and suspicious, taking 2 steps back cautiously. What did he mean he wouldn't lock her up in Channy's Gate? Although she didn't know what Channy's Gate was, it sounded like something terrible. Nighthawks should be the official Beyonders of the Church of the Night, she could understand that, but what was the acting method? Seeing that Hazel had become even more wary instead of letting down her guard, Ember couldn't help but shake his head and say, "It seems you don't understand at all. Anyway, the opportunity is in front of you. Whether you take it or not is up to you." Hazel hesitated for a long time, glanced at the passage behind her, and then pursed her lips as she looked at the path Ember had cleared. Finally, she lowered her head, quietly walked past Ember, and quickly headed towards the exit of the passage. After Hazel disappeared from sight, Ember withdrew his gaze and looked at the passage ahead. The passage was clearly far from finished, and Ember couldn't just dig it out slowly, shovel by shovel. Manual labor. Impossible, not in this lifetime. Besides, why dig when mining? Isn't using explosives obviously more efficient? With this thought, Ember took out the Elder's crystal staff from his space. He aimed the blue crystal at the staff's tip, covered by the stone-like staff body, at the passage in front of him. Without the need for incantations, icy blue magical power surged and churned at the tip of the staff, finally converging into a terrifying torrent. Open black lens bracket soul torrent close black lens bracket. Open black lens bracket when Lothric and the Grand Archives were founded. Magic taught by the first sage. Can shoot a large amount of soul torrent. The first sage was not only one who doubted the transferring fire, but it is also rumored that he was the prince's teacher. Close black lens bracket. Bang! The icy blue energy beam emerged from the tip of the crystal staff, instantly dyeing the passage in front blue. In the darkness of the sewer, the icy blue torrent washed over everything in front, utterly annihilating anything blocking its path. When the light dissipated, only a passage with smooth, flat walls, as if cast from concrete, remained. But before Ember could enter the newly opened passage, a dark shadow suddenly darted out from the deep darkness, rushing straight towards Ember. This was precisely the hidden demigod, Flora Jacob from the Jacob family. Flora had originally just intended to trick Hazel into digging the passage. The moment the other party broke the seal, she could instantly parasite her, turning her into nourishment to restore her own strength. Unfortunately, all of this was ruined by the man before her. However, this wasn't entirely bad. The excavation work that Flora had originally estimated would take another 1 or 2 months to finish was completely destroyed in just a few seconds with this man's help. And the moment the seal was broken, Flora immediately attacked without hesitation. She wanted to parasite this Beyonder from the Church of the Night. This was also why she didn't act rashly when she discovered Hazel was being followed by the other party. Flora was confident that the other party didn't know of her existence, because although he had been guiding Hazel through dreams, he had never told Hazel what she was supposed to be digging for. Hazel had always naively thought she was digging for some treasure, but never considered that what she was digging was her teacher's seal. And Flora had also confirmed that this Beyonder in front of her had come alone. The other party very likely also thought Hazel was digging for some treasure, which was why he didn't report it to the Church of the Night, but instead followed an innocent young woman in the middle of the night, wanting to take the treasure she was digging for all for himself. Although his act of letting Hazel go surprised Flora somewhat, it didn't have a major impact. Because once she successfully parasite this Nighthawk, she would go kill Hazel's family, completely eliminating any trace of her existence. Of course, the premise for all of this was that she could successfully parasite Ember. Although Flora's sneak attack was quite successful, she had never considered why Ember dared to come here alone. As the dark shadow rapidly swept towards Ember, who had just finished releasing Soul Torrent, seemed unable to react, standing still and staring straight at the dark shadow, watching as it drilled into his body. However, the moment the dark shadow just touched Ember's body, she suddenly burst into flames. Literally burst into flames. The dark shadow, which had almost merged with the surrounding environment, suddenly lit up. At first, it was just scattered sparks, and these sparks quickly covered her spirit body, connecting bit by bit, eventually turning into raging flames that burned fiercely. Flora, who was only a spirit body, should have been immune to similar, physical damage. Flames should not have been able to harm her in the slightest. But the flames seemed to contain some higher level power, even Flora's soul was burning. The intense pain was unbearable for this demigod, causing her to let out painful screams. And the process of parasite was forcibly interrupted. This former demigod could only curl up on the ground in pain, struggling desperately. But no matter how she tried to save herself, she couldn't make the flames engulfing her body diminish in the slightest. Of course, she was still considered lucky. The previous demigod who tried to invade Ember went deeper, so he had already been burned to ash. And Flora, if this continued, would inevitably be burned until nothing was left. But this wasn't what Ember wanted. His purpose wasn't to use this demigod as nourishment in the first place. After all, burning a demigod was merely better than nothing, at least burning an angel would be meaningful. If this demigod was really burned until nothing was left, then he would have to find another demigod of the Marauder pathway again. This kind of pointless waste of time clearly didn't align with his expectations. So he actively extinguished the flames covering Flora Jacob, slightly alleviating the pain of her burning. And almost the instant the flames were extinguished, the dark shadow attacked again. She didn't try to continue Parasite Ember, as this had been proven impossible. She just wanted to escape from Ember as quickly as possible now. As long as she left this sewer, she could parasite any passerby. And a parasite residing in someone else's body was definitely not that easy to discover. Ember still stood rooted to the spot, either caught off guard by the dark shadow's escape or simply not caring at all. And when the dark shadow finally escaped the passage and came before the opened secret door, preparing to pass through, an invisible force suddenly surged out from within her. Ah! Amidst the woman's shrill screams, the dark shadow fell to the ground again, flames once more covering her spirit body, consuming everything about her. Why bother? Ember shook his head lightly, walked unhurriedly to the side of the dark shadow, pulled out a small ash box from somewhere, and tossed the demigod, who had completely stopped struggling, inside. Until he gathered 3 sacrifices, this small box would be this demigod's eternal home. Hazel pushed open the manhole cover above her head, glanced down at the deep, dark passage below with lingering fear, and pursed her lips as she closed the cover. She evaded the bodyguard's sight, returned to her room without alerting anyone, her heart filled with unease. She couldn't disobey the command of Ember, this official Beander, but she was also afraid of being punished by her teacher, that legendary demigod. Ember told her to surrender to the Church of the Night tomorrow morning, but perhaps she would dream of her teacher tonight. What should I do? Hazel hugged her legs and curled up on the bed, her mind feeling somewhat lost. Chapter 320, Turn Yourself In. Sunday, early morning. Member of Parliament Mock took his wife and daughter and rode in a carriage to St. Samuel Cathedral early in the morning. When he entered the Grand Prayer Hall, the spacious hall was already filled with believers who had come for the Mass. Member of Parliament Mock was used to this sight. He walked quietly down the aisle separating the seats on the left and right, seeing Mr. Don Tangte sitting in a slightly rear position. Member of Parliament Mock smiled and nodded at Don Tangte, then led his wife and daughter to find an empty spot in the middle section and sat down. On the one hand, this was St. Samuel Cathedral, the headquarters of the Church of the Night Goddess in Backland. Believers of the night naturally wished to be closer to St. Samuel Cathedral, which led to almost all residents in the North District being followers of the Church of the Night Goddess. On the other hand, the Church of the Night Goddess did not have many feast days. The most important was the winter solstice, followed by the Grand Mass during the full moon, also called the Moon Mass, and then the regular Sunday Masses and prayers. Sunday and night were both symbols of the Evernight Goddess. Therefore, a large number of believers would go to church every Sunday to attend Mass. This was not unique to St. Samuel Cathedral, it was the case throughout Backland and even the entire Ruined Kingdom, with almost every church having a continuous stream of believers going there to pray. Of course, because many believers were not wealthy and might not be able to rest on Sundays, and were even busier on weekdays, the churches of the major denominations would stay open until the early morning, and the Church of the Night Goddess would even organize a grand mass in the evening to give most believers an opportunity to pray and confess. In front of the altar, Bishop Electra, who was in charge of this mass, held the revelation of night and began a simple sermon. They are naked and without food or clothing, exposed in the cold. They are drenched by heavy rain, and having no shelter, they cling to the rock. They are mothers whose children have been taken, they are orphans who have lost hope, they are the poor who have been forced away from the right path. The night has not forsaken them, it has bestowed upon them its favored one. The believers all closed their eyes in prayer, clasping their hands and holding them before their mouths and noses, praying earnestly, devoutly and attentively. Echoes overlapped, sound entering their ears one after another, their eyes were dark, but their hearts felt cleansed. Only Hazel mocked, sitting beside her parents, felt incredibly anxious and could not calm down to pray attentively. Compared to the devout believers, although Hazel also closed her eyes, Bishop Electra standing on the altar could almost see her abnormality at a glance. When this part came to an end, the priests took water and bread and distributed them to Mori Mocked and others. Although the food distributed by the Church of the Night Goddess was simple, compared to the breakfast they usually enjoyed, no devout believer would complain about it, they ate it with pleasure. After the Mass, gentlemen and ladies reached into the inner pockets of their clothes and took out their wallets. They voluntarily formed a line and went all the way to the altar. With a kind and compassionate expression from Bishop Electra, they moved diagonally to the offering box, made 4 clockwise dots on their chests, drawing the scarlet moon, and then successively put in donations of different amounts. At the same time, a priest opened the door of the confessional nearby so that believers who had needs could go to the confessional after completing their donations. The Mocked family also queued up. When it was their turn, Mr. and Mrs. Mocked each put 1 gold pound into the offering box. The Church of the Night Goddess did not have mandatory requirements for donations from believers. Believers who had listened to the sermon could either go to the offering box to express their intentions or leave directly. Both choices were up to the believers. The bishops and priests would not give them disgusted looks because of the different donation amounts or if a believer did not donate. Of course, under normal circumstances, believers would voluntarily donate, just in different amounts. Ordinary people were not well off and usually donated only a few pence each time. If a middle-class person's financial situation was slightly better, they would donate 3 to 5 shillings each time. As for the truly wealthy and noble, they donated in gold pounds, but most of the time, it would not exceed 100 pounds. Although the Mocked family belonged to this category, they could not afford a weekly donation of 100 pounds, as this would mean they would have to spend 52,000 gold pounds each year for this. And the amount of 1 pound each time was very suitable, neither too much nor too little. Because this meant a fixed annual donation of 52 pounds, which was enough to pay the annual salaries of 3 maids. Moreover, there were 3 people in the Mocked family, and the total amount of their donations was enough to rent a decent villa in the North District. But unexpectedly, after Mr. and Mrs. Mocked completed their donations, when it was Hazel's turn, the girl with tightly pursed lips took out 100 pounds from her wallet and put it into the offering box at once. Mori Mocked and his wife Liana looked at their daughter with some surprise, not because the amount she donated was too large, that was her own pocket money, and how she handled it was her freedom, they would not ask for the reason. What truly surprised them was why their daughter would do this. Hazel, who had completed her donation, did not leave immediately but looked up at Bishop Electra and said in a low voice, "Your Grace Bishop, I need to confess." Member of Parliament Mocked's expression became somewhat serious, clearly realizing that something must have happened to his daughter. Bishop Electra remained calm and said with a smile, "You can go to the confessional and seek help from the bishop inside, or you can wait a moment, and I can listen to your confession." Hazel thanked him in a low voice, did not waste time, and got up to wait quietly on the side. Liana subconsciously wanted to go forward, wanting to understand Hazel's trouble. As a mother, she had the responsibility and obligation to solve these troubles for her daughter. But before she acted, Member of Parliament Mocked pulled her arm. He said nothing, just shook his head gently at his wife. Liana and Member of Parliament Mocked did not linger, just glanced at their daughter, and then left the church with his wife. Hazel looked at her parents in the distance and couldn't help but breathe a sigh of relief. She was worried about how to face her parents and how to explain everything to them. What happened to her was too bizarre and would bring them a lot of trouble. After waiting for a few minutes, all the believers left the church. Another bishop came to Bishop Electra to take over, preparing to hold a mass for the second batch of arriving believers. Bishop Electra, having completed the handover, walked directly to Hazel and said softly, "Come with me." Hazel nodded silently and quietly followed Bishop Electra. Bishop Electra glanced at the girl beside him. He did not think Hazel would suddenly do something that required confession, and given her parents' status, Bishop Electra felt he needed to consider their image slightly. Therefore, he did not go directly to the confessional but took her through a side passage to leave the grand prayer hall, go around to the library not far from the spiral staircase. Here were rows of large bookshelves filled with various classics related to the Church of the Night Goddess, with some tables and chairs set up on both sides for priests and bishops to study and preach to believers. Bishop Electra chose a table and sat down. The girl with a heavy heart pursed her lips and sat opposite Bishop Electra with some apprehension. Bishop Electra, with a smile that calmed people's hearts, spoke in a mellow voice. "What do you want to say? The goddess favors every one of her believers." Hazel opened her mouth, suddenly finding it difficult to speak. Bishop Electra did not urge her but smiled and comforted her. "It's okay, just treat it as a chat between friends." Did you have a nightmare?" He had seen this girl at Member of Parliament Mocked's villa last night. At that time, she was still as arrogant as usual, disdainful of her peers, thinking they were too young, too shallow, and not capable enough. And only a day had passed, and this arrogant girl had changed completely, like a startled rabbit, wary and fearful of everything around her, as if something was following her and could harm her at any time. Based on reasonable speculation, Bishop Electra believed that Hazel most likely had a nightmare last night. Of course, it might not have been a pure nightmare but contained the influence of some Beander power. Hazel hesitated for a long time and said with some apprehension, "I am guilty, I am a Beander." Bishop Electra smiled and nodded, indicating for Hazel to continue. Hazel felt a little more at ease and said softly, "The one who guided me to become a Beander and enter the mystical world was a demigod." Bishop Electra's smile slightly diminished, becoming a little serious. He often visited Hazel's home, so it was impossible for him not to discover that this girl was already a Beander. But he only thought it was because she herself or her parents had secretly collected potion formulas and Beander materials, which was not uncommon in Ruin's upper class. So generally, the church also turned a blind eye to this situation. Bishop Electra regularly visited the Mocked family, both to ensure the safety of the Mocked family and to ensure that Hazel and the Beanders hired by Member of Parliament Mocked were not at risk of losing control. As long as the sequence was not high and there was no risk of losing control, the church would only register them and would not deal with them immediately. But if Hazel's advancement was related to a demigod, that was another matter. Compared to a low-sequence Beander and a demigod, the damage they could cause was not on the same level at all. Member of Parliament Mocked asked, "Do you know which pathway that demigod is from?" Seeing Bishop Electra's serious expression, Hazel couldn't help but feel a little nervous. "I don't know. I only dreamed of her in my dream and have never seen her in reality." Bishop Electra was not surprised by this answer and asked instead, "Which pathway are you on?" "Marauder. I am now a Sequence 8 swindler." Hazel did not dare to hide anything. Since she had decided to confess, she had to confess everything, otherwise, the things she hid would only become hidden dangers. Marauder pathway. Parasite. Bishop Electra looked deeply at Hazel, and a reassuring smile reappeared on his face, and he said gently, "Miss Hazel, you can continue." Perhaps because she finally spoke the secret buried deep in her heart, Hazel's mood was much lighter. She adjusted her mood and said after a few seconds, "That demigod guided me to become a Beander and then gave me a task, asking me to dig a passage in the nearby sewer. Well, she didn't tell me exactly what was inside, just that there was a powerful mystical item inside. This process lasted for a long time until last night, when I went to the sewer to dig again. But just as I was about to act, the Viscount Black I saw last night, that Viscount Black suddenly appeared. He stopped my action and told me to come to the Church of the Night Goddess today to confess everything that happened to me to the bishop." Viscount Black. Bishop Electra heard this name and couldn't help but look at Hazel in surprise, but his expression became much more relaxed. If it was really your Grace benefactor who took action personally, then the possibility of that parasite parasitizing Hazel could be ruled out. Bishop Electra pondered for 2 seconds, somewhat hesitant about how to handle it. Theoretically, since Hazel was involved with a demigod suspected of being a parasite, she must be dealt with seriously. But she was also related to your Grace benefactor, and she came to the Church of the Night Goddess to turn herself in at your Grace benefactor's request. It would not be good if the punishment was too severe. Seeing Bishop Electra silent for a long time, Hazel's mood became a little uneasy again, and she couldn't help but ask. "Your Grace Bishop, Viscount Black, told me that as long as I confessed to you, you would let me join the Nighthawks and tell me what the acting method is. Is this true?" Bishop Electra looked up at Hazel, and he had already made a decision in his heart. He smiled and said, "Of course, no problem, but we must first ensure that this matter does not leave any hidden dangers." He paused and then continued. "You may not know, the demigod of the Marauder pathway is called Parasite. The demigods of this pathway can hide themselves by parasitizing in others' bodies. They often claim that they have lost their bodies and can only coexist with your spiritual body, can only rely on you, and cannot harm you, and then give you knowledge, formulas, and various benefits, hoping that you will become strong and help him reshape his body or take revenge. In reality, the Beander who is parasitized will only become their nourishment, thereby extending their life and state." The more Hazel listened, the more frightened she became, so the demigod who taught her was a parasite. Her purpose of cultivating herself was for the parasite. Hazel's voice trembled slightly. Have I been parasitized?" Bishop Electra comforted her. "The possibility is very small." Although it was comfort, Bishop Electra felt the possibility was very high. After all, if Hazel was really parasitized, how could she run to the Church of the Night Goddess to turn herself in? Isn't that walking into a trap? What's more, since your grace benefactor took action personally and gave clear instructions, it means that the demigod has most likely been executed. Letting Hazel come to the church was just to ask them to help clean up the mess. Of course, the necessary confirmation still had to be done. Bishop Electra suddenly stood up and comforted her. I'm very sorry, Miss Hazel, please go with them for a checkup to ensure that the parasite is not still in your body. Them. Hazel subconsciously turned her head and saw a young man with black hair and green eyes, looking outstanding, standing there, having appeared at some unknown time. And she had seen him before, also at the dinner party last night. She remembered his name was Leonard Mitchell. For more thrilling fanfiction stories like this, check out my channel Fanfic Audiobook. Dive into epic adventures, mysterious realms, and legendary journeys brought to life through immersive storytelling. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more amazing audiobooks.